Welcome to the audio presentation of Hallie's Hero, Love in Little River, Book 4, by Renee S. Clark. Would you like a free Love in Little River prequel novella? Check out the link in the description for more information.
Chapter 1. Have you seen this? Nash Roberts clicked on the link his friend, Bellamy, had texted him, highly skeptical of it actually warranting all caps and multiple punctuation marks at the end of the text. 2 sentences into the article she had sent, it became clear that he was going to have to talk her down. There was no way he was entering a contest to write an episode of their favorite TV show, He Spies, She Spies. The stupid stuff he wrote in his downtime was a distraction, something to help him de-stress after a crazy day at the Little River Clinic, or to get back to sleep when he got called out in the middle of the night. Sometimes he used it to get his creative juices flowing, to get ready to write his real stuff. His fanfic was not meant to be shared with anyone. Ever. Well, except Bellamy, but that had not been on purpose. He'd been telling her how the writers could have executed the story better in the episode where Declan, the He Spies side of the partnership, got kidnapped by a Mexican cartel. Bellamy had told Nash he should write scripts for the show. He hadn't been paying attention and absent-mindedly responded that he already had. That led to her convincing him to send her some of the fanfic he'd written. She claimed to have a lot of basketball to watch during her next visit to Denver. In her words, she was bound to be bored by all those games, and she could read it on her phone. Nash had offered to go to the games for her, since her star basketball player fiancé always got her the best seats, but she dismissed that pretty quickly. She didn't seem to understand what she was giving up by reading Nash's dumb scripts in her courtside seat rather than actually watching the game. So Nash had stupidly given in, making her promise not to tell anyone. Nobody but Bellamy knew he wrote. If he was writing his own thrillers, and not knock-off He Spies, She Spies stuff, it would be different. He settled back on his couch and set aside his laptop. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since breakfast. He'd been called into the hospital for an emergency after midnight. After that, he'd only gotten a few hours of sleep before he'd headed back to the clinic that morning. Thankfully, the afternoon had been slower than normal, and he'd taken off a few hours early. He'd been de-stressing with some free writing before taking a nap, but he'd need to make himself a sandwich or something first. He glanced at the clock, just past 3, before heading into the kitchen as he called Bellamy. He wouldn't be able to convince her via text that this was a crazy idea. "You don't actually think I'm going to enter this, do you?" he asked when she answered. He put it on speaker phone, dropping the phone on the island as he opened the fridge to grab the sandwich stuff, one of the few food items he kept on hand at his house. Between his crazy schedule, being a bachelor, and Bellamy always dropping off leftovers from her job at the ranch house, he hardly ever cooked himself. Besides that, he could always stop by the diner or his mom's house too. Bellamy huffed out a sigh. "Nash. Are you serious? Your stuff is just as good as the actual episodes, and we both know the show needs some help. The whole, Declan wants to settle down to normal life and Mallory doesn't, was a super lame way to write him off the show. They're keeping options open for when they convince Declan to come back." Truthfully, Nash and Bellamy had discussed at length the various vague articles they'd found about the actor who'd played Declan leaving the show at the end of the season the year before. This latest season had limped along, like everyone had predicted it would, and Nash saw the writing on the wall. He wouldn't be surprised if it got cancelled once this season wrapped up, unless the producers applied some serious life-saving techniques. But despite Bellamy's delusions, that wasn't the kind of life-saving Nash did. He heard the sound of a knife thwacking against a cutting board as Bellamy answered. "That script you showed me for Declan coming back is a way better way for them to wrap up the season, especially if they're going to cancel it like we think. Declan and Mallory need to end up together or no one will be satisfied with the end of the show. You owe it to everyone to give us the happy ending we deserve. You don't seem to understand how embarrassing this is for me." Nash sighed and rubbed his temple. What would everyone in town think if they found out he secretly wrote fake scripts for his favorite TV show? He'd like to write books, thrillers or suspense novels, but the life of a busy small-town doctor didn't hold a lot of room for the kind of research he needed to do. Plotting and organizing for the novel he planned to write someday was coming very slowly. He had a pile of craft books next to his bed to read and a list of online classes still left to take before he could try his hand at real writing. Bellamy gave another of her good gravy sighs. Fine. Use a pen name or something. Not happening, Belle. He finished putting together his sandwich and then flipped on the TV to check and see what time the Mountaineers played that evening. He'd been a casual fan of the basketball team before Bellamy met her fiancé, Coy, but after hanging out with the basketball star, he'd started following all the games. How's Coy's ankle? He asked, hoping that if he changed the subject, Bellamy would let the topic of she spies scripts go. He's fine. He's playing tonight, although half of Twitter says the Mountaineers shouldn't be playing him. Why would they say that? Nash suppressed a chuckle at Bellamy's indignation on Coy's behalf. They think he's risking further injury, and the Mountaineers are a shoo-in to win this series, so some people think it's an unnecessary risk. They're saying they don't need him to win right now, so maybe the coaches should play it safe. She gave a gasp. You think he should be playing it safe? This time he did laugh. It didn't look too serious to me, but I'm not there. It's probably fine, and I'm sure Coy trusts the team doctors. Her voice became muffled as he heard her say, Are you telling the truth? Are you fine? Whatever Coy's response was, Nash didn't hear. Bellamy came back on. He says he's fine. But she sounded worried now, and Nash kind of regretted analyzing the situation for her. He should have said something like, They're just haters. I know you've only got a couple days with Coy until you have to come home, so I'm not going to take up your time, Belle. I'll see you later. Besides, once he finished this sandwich, he did need a nap. You should enter the contest, she said before he could hang up. No way. He didn't let her argue further before tapping the screen and ending the call. He'd miss Bellamy when she moved to Denver in the fall. For now, she and Coy planned to spend summers in Little River, but he knew from Bellamy that Coy's parents wanted them closer to South Carolina once they started a family. Nash hadn't had a lot of time for friendships the past few years. His last relationship had taken all his free time, then he'd started hanging out with Bellamy after it ended. He got together for pickup basketball with a few guys sometimes, but more often than not he had to work or got called away on the nights they got together. Plus there wasn't really a single scene for him and Wyatt, his only other close friend, to mingle in. Little River was a small town. Once Bellamy left, Nash would only have Wyatt, which might be more depressing than the fact that he wrote fake scripts for a dying show. He could always hang out with his mom and dad more. Every time he dropped by for dinner she would always mention that he didn't drop by enough. He chuckled to himself as he finished his sandwich and turned off the TV. The game wasn't starting for a few hours anyway, and he needed some sleep if he planned on staying up to watch it. He glanced at his laptop. The file that held the outline he'd started 2 years ago for his own suspense novel was open. He'd clicked on it after reading through the article that Bellamy had sent, like he felt guilty for the scriptwriting he'd been doing just before that. The only work he'd done on his real writing over the last several weeks had been reading through the chapter-by-chapter paragraphs he had and finding the holes where he needed to research to fill things in. He snapped the laptop shut and headed for his bedroom. Maybe the show getting cancelled would force him to stop living in a dreamland and actually do something serious with his writing. Chapter 2. Something told Nash to shut the door when Bellamy showed up on his doorstep a few weeks after their conversation about the contest with a pile of disposable aluminum pans stacked in her arms. "What's this?" he asked, stepping aside as she marched past him, through his living room, and right to his kitchen. She deposited the pans in a line on his counter, then went to his cupboards to get plates. "Bellamy," he prodded. He'd grown used to the fact that Bellamy knew her way around his kitchen. She knew her way around a lot of kitchens in Little River. She'd cooked a meal in her fair share, truth be told. But she moved about his now with an air of avoidance. He gave a sigh and sat down at his small, square kitchen table, watching her plate a meal of pork ribs, homemade macaroni and cheese, and her famous biscuits. She set it down in front of him, handing over his utensils, and then said, "Eat," pointing at the plate as she did so. He obediently scooped up a bite of her macaroni and cheese, smiling as he put the creamy noodles in his mouth. Bellamy was up to something. The delicious food said so. And he was pretty sure she meant to fill his mouth and bribe him with the slightly spicy mac and cheese into complacency on whatever she wanted. She'd been bugging him to ask out a nurse that was filling in at the clinic. He was delaying until the nurse was done. Dating co-workers was tricky, and he didn't want to get caught in something awkward. So, Jonah Welling's assistant called me today. Bellamy went back to the kitchen, plating her own meal, he presumed. Nash took another bite of the macaroni and cheese, trying to decide why that name sounded familiar. "Jonah Welling?" he asked when he'd swallowed his bite. Bellamy turned to him but cast her gaze to the ceiling with a guilty glance, chewing on her lips. He's the executive producer and director of Spies, She Spies." Nash blinked at Bellamy, pieces of what she was probably about to say falling into place. He put his spoon down and scooted back in the chair, shaking his head and ready to sacrifice this traitorous meal. Nope. 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 He was not going to eat this and let Bellamy work her food magic and convince him to do something with that script. "Eat," Bellamy commanded again. Nash remained standing. "I sent in your script," she said in a rush, her tone thick with "please just hear me out." "Under a pen name. Robert Nash." "Wow, Belle. Really creative. No one's going to figure that out." She put her plate on the table and held her hands out. "The assistant said Mr. Welling loves it. Like really loves it. She said they didn't even think twice before deciding on it. And even though they can't get Declan back, they want to work with your ideas, and they're bringing the show to Little River." Her next words came out in a bigger rush, each word blending so close to the next that Nash almost didn't understand her. "I pretended to be your assistant, and I said yes because this is a big deal for Little River, and bringing in a whole crew is really something, and you have to do this." Nash had to sit after that announcement. He started eating again, because bribe or not, Bellamy owed him this meal and many more. "Nash, think of the town," she said, making prayer hands from her side of the table. "Ha," he barked. "They want to film an episode of He Spies, She Spies in Little River," she persisted. "Think of the business Addie will do. And Mrs. Jones's dessert shop. Sam's motel. The catch fame won't last forever." Nash pointed his spoon at her. "You didn't do this for the town." "Maybe not, but I gotta convince you somehow. You wrote something amazing and it's silly to keep it hidden because you don't think it's the right kind of writing for a serious doctor." Bellamy scowled at him and folded her arms. "You need to call them back and tell them no." He stared down into his plate, trying to dismiss the idea that Jonah Welling had loved his script, if Bellamy wasn't exaggerating to convince him. "We can't. By submitting it Nash looked up and raised his eyebrows. "I agreed to give the script to the network. So I'm sure you could, argue that I can't agree on your behalf and all that, but they'll probably still get it." "I'm sorry." She grimaced. "I should have read the terms, but you know how that is. They're so long." Nash put his spoon down again. "There has to be a way out of this. Print up the terms for me so I can take it to Wyatt." Wyatt had been a lawyer before he joined Little River's police force and eventually became police chief. "Already took it by. That's how I know they'll probably still get it." Bellamy focused on her plate. "So now Wyatt knows that I wrote the script." Nash clenched his fists underneath the table. Do you realize how much you violated my privacy, Belle? She pressed a hand over her eyes. Yes. I know. I am the worst friend, I really get it. She dropped her hand and looked up at him. I wasn't thinking. I thought it would get you to see how great you are. I didn't think through what it would come to when you won. When I won. Nash chuckled dryly. You have a lot of confidence in me. She gave him a fierce scowl. Yes, I knew you were going to win, Nash. The entries were posted for people to read. That's part of the hype. She held up a hand when Nash blanched. Don't worry. Robert Nash, remember? And I made the screen name really vague. R-Nash00. Nobody knows it was you. She waved her hand around. Anyway, yours was the top read, top liked, all of that. People were begging for it. So yeah, I knew you'd win. He couldn't help that the praise made the weight in his chest lighten at the thought of his work being made public, of writing he had never intended anyone to see being tossed out into the world. So. He drew in a long breath. What do I have to do, assistant? Even with his acquiescence, Bellamy's shoulders didn't relax. She pushed around the food on her plate for a few moments. They want you to do a couple promos with the cast. No. Tell me that's not in the contract. The more he could keep under wraps about his involvement in the show coming to town, the better. Bellamy and his mom, well, and now Wyatt, were the only people in town who knew about his writing. If he didn't have to do the promos, he could pretend to be as starstruck as everyone else. It was one thing for other fans to know he'd written this, quite another for the nurses he worked with too. It wasn't that he minded the spotlight, he didn't. Every once in a while when he was watching late-night TV, he pictured himself chatting with the host, talking about his best-selling novel that had been made into a blockbuster movie. He wasn't writing for the fame, but he wouldn't mind it if it came. But not for someone else's story. I don't think it's in the contract. She gave a shrug, her words bringing him back to the conversation at hand. Nash started in on his ribs. So I'll expect dinner for the next couple weeks at least. Of course. Bellamy didn't even hesitate. Nash sighed again, looking up at her and shaking his head. He really loved it. Oh my gosh, Nash. His assistant was raving about it and the small town setting and how they wanted to get in on how trendy Little River was right now. Little River. Bellamy finally relaxed and Nash couldn't help but smile at her excitement. She emailed me the notes, Bellamy went on. Saying he loved it seems like an understatement. I mean, he had criticism, but like in a way that you could tell he was involved. Nash paused as he lifted the ribs. Bellamy had some kind of secret sauce that was perfectly sweet and had just the right amount of barbecue sauce, even though Nash didn't even really like barbecue sauce. You read his notes before you told me? Bellamy blushed and gave a shrug. I knew I'd have to convince you they loved it. Send it over. He went back to his dinner, glad for the silence as Bellamy picked up her phone and tapped across the screen for a few minutes. The embarrassment that he'd written that script was starting to recede. If the director liked it, and if they were going to film the episode, he could consider that it wasn't as silly as he kept convincing himself. It might be good. He might have a shot at writing suspense novels. Sent. Bellamy set her phone back down next to her and picked up her fork. So what do you want for dinner tomorrow? If only forgiveness were that easy.
Hallie Butler stared at Jonah from across the tiny cafe table at the coffee shop down the street from her condo. She tried to keep her jaw from going totally slack. You're serious? You think this fanfic script is going to save Spies? Jonah tapped his phone. This one specifically? Not unless we can get Quinn back, but there are some ideas in here I really like. This guy is the contest winner, hands down. Hallie clenched her jaw. The contest was a stupid idea. She glanced over at Allison, the head of publicity for the show. The marketing team had come up with the contest to drum up excitement about the show and viewership, a last-ditch effort to save Spies. But Quinn was the only one who could save the show at this point, and he was too selfish to do it. Hallie ignored the wiggle of panic that kept sliding through her at the rumors passing around that this was it for Spies unless something drastic happened. She'd been on the show for 5 years now. It was her only big credit and had been the catapult for her into stardom. She could count on some good parts after it ended, but what if she didn't find anything to fit for her again the way Spies did? She didn't want to be stuck in a show she didn't like because she landed the part in the wake of her Spies' success. Stupid Quinn. This is set in a small town, and the vibe is cool, Allison broke in. Plus, we've got hype behind us if we take it to a place called Little River, where the contest winner is from. You know that country star, Taggart Du Bois? He did a kickoff concert there for his hometown tour a few years ago and blew up the internet trying to win his high school sweetheart back. Then the last season of The Catch and that twist of Coy Jones falling for a girl there? It's all golden, Hallie. If we want to save this show, we can ride this wave. Hallie looked down at her tablet and the copy of the script she'd spent last night reading. It was good, she could admit that, and she liked the ideas too. A lot of it was impossible with Quinn gone. The plot hinged on his character being called in for retirement after an old flame gets into trouble with the agency, and then the beginning of a rekindling of Declan and Mallory's explosive relationship. She imagined the writer had some even better ideas for wrapping it up so Declan and Mallory got their happily ever after. Maldac, as people like to call the Mallory/Declan ship, had carried the show all 5 seasons. First, through the beginning with the obvious chemistry between the two actors and the witty writing that had played them so well off each other. Then had come the episode when Declan and Mallory had been forced to confront their feelings for each other after Declan took drugs on an undercover operation and Mallory almost had to sacrifice her life to save him. It had been the most watched episode of any show on the network that season, and there were still memes all over the internet from it. Things are dire? Hallie murmured, avoiding looking at Jonah. The network asked us to have the writers come up with an alternate finale that wraps things up. Jonah picked up his coffee cup and took a sip, shrugging at Hallie. Allison shared a look with both of them. Rumor is they're willing to pay Quinn a lot of money if he'll come back for 1 or 2 scenes for it. Hallie turned to Jonah. I thought we were going with a new love interest. Those scenes we shot last week were good. Hallie had liked the idea of Mallory falling for the new character, a bad boy who was also a good guy thief. Maybe he'll grow on people. Jonah shrugged. Hallie had stopped following the online reactions to her show after the episode where Mallory betrayed Declan to save her younger sister. People had been harsh even though she'd redeemed herself. It's bad? Hallie asked. The problem is that we don't have time to win people over, Allison said. A few more episodes, at most, and we can't risk taking this new relationship all the way to the end of the season and then it not working out, Jonah added. The two were tag-teaming her. We have to try this new script and see if we can buy some time to make the new guy the next Declan. Hallie had trusted her director for so long. She'd worked with him on a couple episodes of another show for the network, and he'd asked her to come in for a screen test when they were casting He Spies, She Spies. He knew what he was talking about. Hallie drew in a deep breath. Why are you selling this so hard to me? Why haven't you just told me to pack up and get ready to spend a couple weeks in this place, Little River, you said? We'd like you to do promo stuff with the guy who wrote it, and maybe, if he's not a terrible actor, have him do a bit part. Allison grimaced. Aw. I have to schmooze some nerd who's obsessed with the show. Hallie rolled her eyes. You know I care about this show as much as you. I'll do my part. Jonah grinned, his shoulders relaxing. You a Taggart Du Bois fan? Or Coy Jones? We're trying to get a cameo from one of them. Hallie pressed her lips together to keep from grinning. She'd made calls herself to help the casting director make that happen. Truth was, she was a Coy Jones fan, though she'd been Team Charlotte during his season of The Catch, a dating reality show. But Hallie's assistant knew someone who worked for the show and had heard that Coy fell hard for Bellamy Hansen from the moment he met her, and his relationship with Charlotte was friendship from the beginning. I've been known to watch The Catch a time or two, Hallie admitted. And you're forgetting about Drew North. Isn't his girlfriend from there too? The one he met while he was visiting Taggart Du Bois for the holidays a couple years ago? Allison snapped her fingers and widened her own smile. That's right. I forgot about them. Jonah chuckled quietly before reaching across the table to take Hallie's hand. This will be fine, Hallie. Everyone is raving about this town and the ranch house. I heard one of the Hemsworths stayed there a few months ago. He waggled his eyebrows before standing up. Hallie gave him a reassuring smile. Everyone was worried about the fate of the show, especially Jonah, who'd put his heart and soul into the last 5 years. I can't wait, she said. Hopefully the writer wasn't a total basement dweller or a creeper with an altar to Mallory Ryder. Hallie could definitely get through a few appearances with him, and if going to Little River could save her show, she'd get there as soon as she could. Chapter 3. When the SUV pulled off the highway onto a small county road that looked newly paved, Hallie gave a sigh of relief at seeing a tall, Victorian-era mansion rising up in the distance. The ranch house website showed off every bit of the beauty that surrounded the bed and breakfast, the deep brown fields surrounding it, dots of green poking up here and there, and blue mountains in the distance as the backdrop. And a lot of empty space. Why isn't this place closer to, what was that town with the airport? Hallie turned to Jonah, who sat in the seat opposite her, flicking away at his tablet the way he had been since they left, whatever that town was called, almost an hour ago. Casper, Jonah said. He looked up at her over his reading glasses. He was barely over 40 but had terrible eyesight. He did have square, hipster-like frames, but the way he peered at her over the top sort of ruined the young vibe he was going for. And what do you mean? You know. She waved at all the land around them and indicated back toward the highway. There's plenty of space. Why is this town so far away? Jonah squinted at the fields and shrugged. There's a museum in town. I'm sure someone there could tell you why Casper is where it is and why Little River is where it is. There's only like 500,000 people in Wyoming. One of Jonah's assistants popped her head forward from where she sat in the back seat. If they all lived next to each other, there'd be like one city here. It's kinda weird, Hallie said, staring around her again. The space made her feel small in a different way than living in LA did. In California, she was one person among so many and sometimes felt insignificant, even as famous as she was. There was an actress around every corner. This was insignificant in a more uncomfortable way. Like if their SUV had run off the road 20 miles back, how long would it have taken someone to find them? The cell service had been spotty. Worry had clawed up Hallie's throat when the thought attacked, and she'd spent several minutes taking deep breaths. Her logical self knew that the panic was more tied to the uncertainty around Spies than the vast Wyoming landscape, but she preferred blaming it on a serious overabundance of sagebrush. When the SUV pulled into the long, circular drive of the mansion, a few young men spilled out of the front door, pulled open the backs of the vehicles, and hauled out luggage and equipment. Another SUV pulled in behind them with a few more of Hallie's co-stars. The rest of the crew and cast would be lodged at the few hotels in town. Hallie followed Jonah up the walkway and onto the front porch, where the door sat open, waiting for their arrival. A familiar woman, though Hallie couldn't quite place her, stood in the foyer of the beautiful home. That's what it felt like, a home. Not a hotel, even an upscale one. Hallie's insides itched. It was kind of weird not to have the sort of sterile hotel environment. Instead, it was like the woman and the tall, dark-haired man behind her were welcoming them to their own house and putting them up in their guest rooms. "Welcome to the ranch house," the woman said, giving them all a smile. "I'm Bellamy Hanson?" The words spilled out of Hallie's mouth before she could stop them. Bellamy's lips twitched in a way that froze her smile and made it look tired. Of course, every guest who came through here probably said the same thing. Well, maybe not whatever Hemsworth had stayed here. Yep. Then her smile relaxed. "Are you a Catch fan?" Hallie's embarrassment disappeared under the sweet smile the woman offered. "Yes. Don't hate me, but I was Team Charlotte. Charlotte is amazing. But I'd never let her have Koi. Not in a million years." Hallie burst into laughter. "It's real then?" Bellamy raised her eyebrows, and if possible, her smile stretched further. "Oh yeah. And you're also Mr. Nash's assistant?" Jonah peered at Bellamy, and her cheeks instantly flamed. "Just for this one little thing." Then she forced a laugh. The man, whose brown eyes looked like chocolate, stepped from behind Bellamy. "You can call me Nash," he said, holding out his hand to Jonah. Hallie's eyebrow quirked without her permission. He went by his last name? Sure, he was far better looking than she'd expected, but was he one of those hometown heroes who still lived his high school glory days? Had he been the star quarterback in high school? Nash? Hallie couldn't help asking. At least he still had the physique of a quarterback. She'd give him that. Tall, broad shoulders, what looked like toned arms under the slim-fitting button-up shirt. She stopped her gaze before it wandered further. Now Nash's cheeks reddened. "Nash is actually my first name. Not my last name. Nash Roberts." He held out his hand to Hallie and reddened further. Probably at the way she pressed her lips together to keep from laughing. Bell made up the pen name. He sighed. Bellamy forced another laugh. "I'm not the creative one and he didn't give me a lot of direction." Nash snorted at that and rolled his eyes. She looked away and back to Hallie and Jonah. "If you come this way, I can show you up to your rooms." She beckoned them toward the stairs, even taking the first step up like she was eager to get them all moving. "What do you do?" Jonah asked Nash as he followed them. "I'm in medicine." Hallie swung her gaze back to him, her eyes widening. Medicine, the nice slacks and button-up made her think doctor. She couldn't even say what she'd expected to find that the fanfic writer did. Maybe professional gamer? Or mother's basement dweller? Unemployed? She cringed at her judgmental thoughts, but medicine definitely hadn't been on the list. Something brilliant like medicine should have been on her list, though. The script was tight. Everything was true to the Spies world. And if Declan was still around, she didn't think Jonah would have changed much. Nash had nailed the tension that would exist in Mallory's and Declan's relationship, but also the thread that made it so they couldn't stay apart. Plus he had the snappy repertoire between Jack and Nixon, the fictional heads of the agency. If Jonah hadn't warned her when he sent over the script that it had been written by one of the contest entrants, she would have thought it came from their own writers, dreaming about how they would have liked to send off Mallory and Declan into their Mr. and Mrs. Smith-esque happily ever after. The guy who wrote it was smart, and she should have realized that. Nash raised his eyebrows, and Hallie blinked. Her turn to blush. Heat raced through her cheeks at the fact that she'd stared at him for a long time, dumbfounded over his profession. "That's cool," she stuttered. "How are you with acting?" Jonah asked, smoothly transitioning the conversation. He could have stepped in sooner. She'd lecture him later on that. I'm sorry. Bellamy mentioned you wanted to do some promos, but I don't think I'm going to be able to find time for that. Nash rushed his apology, sticking his hands in his pockets when he went on. His nerves seemed to tighten in the air around them. The meetings you have for me to get with the other writers are already going to be tough. We only have 2 doctors at the clinic, and we get called into the hospital a lot. Jonah frowned as they all stopped in the middle of a hallway of doors. We need the promotion. Can you at least squeeze in a few photo shoots with Hallie? We'll see. Nash added a forced laugh, and Hallie got the impression he was really saying, I'll do anything to get out of this. She was going to cross an altar to Mallory Ryder off her list of things to find in his bedroom. But maybe he still had a poster? Well, this is your room, Ms. Butler, Bellamy said with a glance at Nash. He threw a look of gratitude in her direction, confirming Hallie's suspicions that Bellamy had stepped into the conversation to save him, far sooner than Jonah had for her. Bellamy led the way into the room. People have started calling it Roxy's room, since this is where Taggart Du Bois stayed when he wrote the album that finally won that stubborn girl over. It's got the best view. She chuckled and pointed out the window toward the majestic mountains rising up in the distance. Next time you come stay with us, maybe the new guest house will be done. Guest house. Hallie leaned forward, noting the construction off in the distance. Bellamy nodded. Roxy is expanding the ranch house amenities to include some private guest houses. We have the one over at the AA ranch, but it's always booked by, clients who want a little more privacy. Like a Hemsworth? Hallie teased. Bellamy cast her a grin and strode out of the room, leading Jonah across the hall, and then heading further down, assigning rooms like the junior camp leader at the acting camp Hallie had gone to every summer from 10 until she turned 16. Hallie turned back to the window. The vastness of the emptiness was sort of awe-inspiring if she didn't think too hard about how long it would take to get to a major medical center in case of an emergency. Farther down the road they'd come in on, Hallie could make out the shape of a couple more houses. Her gaze wandered back to the towering mountains. Her film schedule had her doing a chase scene later in the week over one of the trails. She fell back onto the bed, sighing at how soft the comforter was and how she sank into the bed just the right amount. Please let this work, she thought, staring at the scenery of the room around her. She didn't want to lose Spies.
Chapter 4. Nash tapped on the door in front of him, grabbing the file in the clear plastic file holder next to the exam room door as he waited. Come in, came the voice of an older woman. He pushed open the door, blinking at his mother, who sat in one of the chairs in the room, looking through a magazine. He dropped down onto his own chair and rolled up closer to her. What's up, Mom? He asked, looking down at the file before him. Oh, nothing. She chuckled and flipped it shut, calming her laugh into a mischievous smile when he raised an eyebrow at her and glanced pointedly around the room. Madeline still owes me for filling in for her during her honeymoon, she said, speaking of one of the clinic receptionists. Nash released a long sigh. You could have texted me and told me to stop by tonight. Or come by at lunch. He placed the useless file on the counter. I've texted you 5 times this week and you've put me off every time. And I did come by at lunch. You worked through it, so Madeline texted me when you had a cancellation this afternoon. She tilted her head to one side. Son, what does it say when I find out about he spies, she spies coming to town from Mrs. Townsend's blog? And Bellamy's the one to tell me they're doing your script? He squinted at her. I told you about that. You sound like your dad. She laughed sharply. Now he scowled. A few nights after Bellamy told him, he'd had dinner with his parents, but he'd still been trying to keep things quiet. Maybe he really hadn't said anything. You write screenplays? His mom leaned back in the chair, clearly meaning to take advantage of her time with Nash and not wait for him to mount an argument about filling her in. It was mostly just freewriting. He explained about Bellamy submitting it to the contest. His mom's eyes shone with pride at every word of praise he passed on, nodding in agreement with all of Bellamy's moves. "Smart girl," she even murmured. His mom had passed along enough hints about him making a move on Bellamy that he knew her opinion there. But small town or not, he couldn't have dated Bellamy after dating her best friend. Well, it's a good thing she submitted that. Sounds like we wouldn't have been able to have all this excitement without it. His mom leaned forward and took Nash's hands in hers. "It's about time you let loose some of your brilliance." He couldn't help the scoff that escaped at the script being called brilliant. His mom gently slapped at his arm. "Bellamy raved all about it when I went to see her earlier," his mom said. "And I won't hear anything less." She stood, pressing his shoulders to make him stay put when he tried to follow suit. He chuckled softly as she wrapped her arms around his shoulders and leaned her head over his. "My time is up. I promised Madeline I wouldn't put you behind schedule. But you will come to dinner tonight and tell me more." She leaned back to pin him with a demanding glare. "Bellamy is making me dinner tonight." He grimaced. "I promise that's not an excuse, Mom." He held up his hands. "I love you, but her burgers. I thought that woman was marrying Coy Jones." His mom raised an eyebrow. "She owes me. For the whole submitting my manuscript without my permission thing. She even made me a punch card. Very efficient." He stood to walk his mom out. "Stop by later then, please." She squeezed his hand when they reached the door to the reception area. He bent and kissed her cheek. "If I don't get called in." She sighed, shaking her head and muttering, "Doctors," as she walked out. Nash watched as Bellamy packed a burger and some homemade fries into a styrofoam container for him. True to her word, she'd been making him dinner a few times a week for the last several weeks. It turned out to be a better deal than dinner every night for just a couple. Nash was getting spoiled, and he'd have a hard time going back to his own cooking. She was about to serve this same dinner to the guests who'd arrived, and Nash had intended to sit down to eat with them, but a call had come from the hospital, and he needed to head out. His mom wouldn't believe him, but he shouldn't be too late, so he'd probably still have time to run by. The excuse to get home and get some work done on his writing might even pacify her now that the whole he spies, she spies thing had happened. The call to the hospital wasn't urgent, but he was actually grateful for it, since he could prove his statement to Mr. Welling that he likely wouldn't have time for promotional stuff, even if he actually wanted to. Nash tried not to guess at the tone of Mr. Welling's "I understand" text when Nash had informed him he couldn't stay to have dinner. "I'm starting to regret this," Nash said as Bellamy prepped a container of ketchup and then moved to add in her homemade fry sauce to another. What if Mr. Welling didn't actually believe that Nash had been called in? The director was somewhere around the ranch house, according to Bellamy, and he could probably see that Nash wasn't rushing off anywhere. "You've been regretting this since day one," Bellamy said dryly. She snapped the lid closed and handed it over. "Your script is awesome, just as professional as any of the writers on the show, and it should be. You've spent so long learning about writing and reading all those books you have that it's time you put your skills to use." "I still have a lot to learn." He took the container from her before moving toward the back door. "You heard Mr. Welling," Bellamy lectured. "He loved it. You heard with your own vegan ears, Nash. Stop second-guessing yourself." She pointed at the door, her indication that the argument was over. Also, the use of her worst food swear word said a lot. She liked to call Nash a vegan when she was most irritated with him, even though it was pretty far from the truth. Ironic that she used it now when she'd just packed up a hamburger for him. He'd heard her use it in reference to some of Coy's haters on Twitter a time or two as well. Too bad none of them actually knew the severity of the profanity she was tossing at them. "Funny how you keep turning this around like I'm the bad guy here," he muttered as he walked out. Bellamy sighed before the door shut behind him. He came out onto the porch to find Mr. Welling and Hallie, Ms. Butler, sitting in the cluster of outdoor chairs nearest the door. He'd spent so much time in the He Spies, She Spies world, it was hard to think of her as Ms. Butler, but the actress hadn't corrected Bellamy when she'd greeted her with that name. Ms. Butler probably had to distance herself from people getting too familiar, the way Bellamy had to figure out how to keep catch conversations short with the guests. Mr. Welling held out his hands in pleading, and Ms. Butler shook her head. "You know that's impossible." She looked up at Nash and clapped her mouth shut. "Sorry," he said. He grimaced as he walked past them on the steps. "It's fine," Ms. Butler said, her tone tight. But both she and Mr. Welling stopped talking until Nash was down the steps, and then only continued in hushed voices. "Quinn will not even take my calls." "There's no way," Ms. Butler hissed just before Nash climbed into his Jeep. He tried to keep his eyes off her as he started the Jeep and backed out, but she was gorgeous. He knew that. He'd watched every episode of He Spies, She Spies. Part of him must have always assumed it was TV magic. It wasn't. She had high cheekbones, wide blue eyes, and her thick, brown hair spilled out of the ponytail on top of her head. Plus there was the fact that her surprise at seeing it was him who had written the script kept nagging at him. She'd stared for long enough that he couldn't help noting her checking him out. The disbelief in her gaze had taken some of the enjoyment out of the moment, but Hallie Butler had checked him out. And apparently they were trying to get Quinn Holloway to come back. Maybe to film this episode. It felt dumb, but a flicker of excitement sparked in Nash's chest. Getting the actor who played Declan back for this episode meant not just pulling Nash's main ideas and making them work. They could film his actual story. His actual words would become real, like an actual writer. He couldn't help one more glimpse of Ms. Butler as he pulled away from the ranch house to head for town. Her expression was still tense as she listened to whatever Mr. Welling was saying. Then she glanced at Nash and he paused, his foot seeming to stick on the brake as he held her gaze. She looked kind of desperate, and he wanted to help. He finally pulled his foot from the brake and drove away from the building, shaking his head at the moment. Bellamy had told him after he broke up with his last girlfriend, Roxy, that he was a fixer. He couldn't see a situation and not figure out how to fix it. Seeing He Spies, She Spies fall apart this season was a case in point. Or when he'd run into Roxy at the clinic and she was all torn up over whether or not she should give her high school sweetheart a second chance. He'd still been hurting then, despite knowing she had been right that she and Nash were better off friends, but he'd helped her anyway, giving her advice on going after Tag. Now Nash knew that he and Roxy might have been friends like he and Bellamy were if they hadn't muddied things up by dating, but maybe that had been him fixing again. He and Roxy had spent a lot of time together before they started dating. There was a spark. He'd probably told himself he had to fix that spark and make it something real, even if it had never been meant to be. He could surmise enough from the conversation he'd overheard while leaving the ranch house that Mr. Welling wanted Ms. Butler to try and get Quinn Holloway to come back for this episode, and she didn't think she could do it. Nash thought back to the articles he'd read about Quinn Holloway's departure, but nothing mentioned discord on set between the two principal actors. What had happened? And good idea or not, how could Nash help fix it?
Chapter 5. For some reason, standing on Main Street in this tiny town, wearing a pair of tight, dark skinny jeans, a leather jacket, and heeled boots made Hallie feel 10 times as ridiculous as when she wore this exact same outfit on the set back in LA. It could be the crowd of people standing just outside of the perimeter the crew had set up, cell phones in hand, snapping pictures and filming video of their own. Maybe it was the knowledge that she might happen upon one of these small-town gawkers when she was around town. That never happened in LA. She leaned up against the wall of the nearby diner, which was just named the Diner. She supposed in a town this small, one didn't need anything more distinguishing than the ranch house or the diner. There was only one of each anyway. She pulled the Doug Robbins book from her bag slung over her shoulder and flipped to her bookmark to kill time waiting for them to set the scene. She was already early since she was supposed to be snapping pictures with Dr. Nash, but he texted 20 minutes before, saying he was delayed. Hallie had tried to be irritated about it, but then she'd pictured his broad shoulders and tall form in scrubs and her irritation had flown out the window. She'd looked him up on the local clinic's website and discovered that he was, indeed, a doctor. She found herself kind of wishing that he did have a Mallory Rider altar at his house. The worry in the way he'd met her eyes last night while she was talking to Jonah made her curious about him. It also made him even more attractive than he already was. How many times had Quinn snapped at her for worrying about anything when she was this successful? It was like hearing the grown-up version of "there are starving kids in Africa who would love to eat your green beans. I'm assuming you have the new Doug Robbins book because you pulled strings." Hallie looked up over the book and smirked at Nash. It was a perk of being on the show and of Robbins being a fan. "Yeah, Jonah pulled strings for me. Jealous?" He leaned forward, then rocked back and took a step away. "Obviously. That doesn't even come out until Christmas," he said. She made a show of shoving the hardbound book into her bag and protecting it, and Nash chuckled. "You're a fan too?" she asked. He nodded. "I started reading him when I got back to Little River after my residency, back when we had a few more doctors and I had more downtime. They're the best." Hallie clapped her hands together under her chin and then quickly dropped them when Nash's smile widened. "Jonah's in talks to maybe do Newsflash as a movie after Spies." Hallie realized what she'd said and clamped her lips together. "Not that." He held a hand up. "I get it." And his expression, a slight frown and sadness in his eyes, said he did actually get it. Given how involved he was in the Spies world, he probably understood more than a lot of people did about the direction the season had gone. His script said as much. Anyway, since they're talking about doing a movie, Jonah sweet-talked Robbins into an early copy of his newest book. She shrugged. "Wanna borrow it when I'm done?" "Are you expecting me to give you a polite, 'No, that's okay'?" He raised an eyebrow at her. She liked the eagerness lighting up his expression. Especially the excitement for a Doug Robbins book. Jonah had only pursued a movie with the author on Hallie's suggestion. No one else she knew dug Robbins's thrillers. "I'd like you less if you gave me the polite answer," she said. He rocked forward again, and this time didn't immediately shift back. His smile looked almost startled. "Does that mean you like me some?" he asked. She smiled. The chill vibe to his question, no arrogance and only a tiny bit of charm, made goosebumps rise on her arm. She liked him some. Yes. Definitely. She'd started to last night and this whole conversation had only added to that. "You ready for some pictures?" she asked instead of answering. His shoulders tensed. "Oh. Is there time for that?" Hallie tilted her head. "Are you embarrassed to take pictures with me?" "That's unexpected." Ha ha ha. There was too much breath in Nash's fake laugh, and Hallie's eyebrows rose with every syllable. He stopped laughing. "No one knows I did this," he said in a low voice, like even the crew and actors milling around, waiting to shoot the scene, didn't know either. He scrubbed a hand through his hair. "It's not what I thought I was going to get recognized for writing." Hallie scowled. "Why wouldn't you want to get recognized for this? I thought you were like a Spies superfan." "Oh, I am." His cheeks turned red. "I have to know if you have a Mallory Rider shrine." Nash's shoulders loosened again. "Obviously." He put his hands in his pockets and glanced around. "It's fanfic when I want to be writing Doug Robbins books. You shouldn't get down on yourself about that script." Hallie folded her arms in front of her. You stayed true to the Spies world and the characters, and that's hard to do in someone else's world. I think you should be proud. He gave her a small smile. That's what Bellamy keeps saying. Bellamy's right. Hallie pulled out her phone from her back pocket. Selfie? She moved to stand next to him. Even in her heeled boots, he still stood a few inches taller than her. She leaned in and let their shoulders brush as she held out the phone. Okay. Sure. He tipped his head over hers to get in the frame and flashed a smile as Hallie snapped the picture. He had a good smile. I'll have my assistant post this. Is that okay? She tried to keep her expression professional even though giggles threatened to rise up at him being embarrassed to post a picture with her. He rolled his eyes and nodded. Yes. That's fine. Coffee. Wendy, Hallie's assistant, strolled from the diner and held out a cup with the diner scrolled across it in teal, 50s-style cursive. Hallie took it the same time Wendy turned to Nash. What about you, Dr. Nash? Can I go grab you something? Hallie snorted the hot coffee right up her nose and nearly yelped. Having Wendy call him by the saucy nickname Hallie had given him in her head would have made her laugh out loud if she wasn't cringing in pain. Nash gave Hallie a sidelong glance. I'm good. Thanks. And Nash is actually my first name. Robert Nash is a really bad pen name given to me by my really bad assistant. Are you looking for a job? You seem more competent. Wendy chuckled. Their coffee is good, doctor, she trailed off, waiting for Nash to supply his actual last name. And Hallie didn't think she was mistaking the flirtatious glint to her assistant's expression. Maybe calling him Dr. Nash wasn't actually an accident. Wendy was very competent in her job, and Hallie wouldn't put it past her to know Nash's real name already. Roberts, he said. Wendy's eyebrows jumped, and she let out a short laugh, pretty much the same reaction Hallie had to finding out that Bellamy had only switched around his names to come up with his pen name. I told you. Really bad. But just call me Nash. Hallie fought a scowl as she took another cautious sip of her coffee. Very good for diner coffee. She focused on that and tried to push away her suspicions that Nash might be flirting back with Wendy. No, he wasn't, was he? He was chatting, the same way he had been with Hallie before Wendy showed up. Except, some of his and Hallie's chatting had been flirting. At least she hoped so. Mr. Nash? Another voice joined the conversation, and Jonah's assistant walked up behind Wendy. Nash pinched the bridge of his nose. Hallie hid her smile behind her coffee cup. Can someone send out a memo? He muttered under his breath. Nash is actually my first name. Nash Roberts. Yes, I know the pen name is ridiculous. Jonah's assistant took his announcement in stride. Jonah was wondering if you would be able to sit in on a meeting with the writers. They want to discuss their ideas for the script with you in case we can't get Mr. Holloway to come. Nash shot a glance at Hallie, but he wasn't surprised at the suggestion that Quinn might show up. He must have heard more of the conversation between her and Jonah last night than she'd thought. Sure. Of course. He turned to Hallie. See you later? I mean, see you around, of course. He nodded without waiting for an answer and marched away from the group, making Jonah's assistant catch up so she could pull him in the right direction, down the street to the main hotel in town. Which was surprisingly called the Crystal Lake Hotel and not just the hotel. Hallie supposed there were two of those, not even counting the ranch house. He's hot, Wendy said. Hallie took another sip of her coffee. Hallie, Wendy whined. Really? You like him? Hallie's grin widened. I definitely like him some. Huh? Hallie waved her off. Any messages? If you mean did Quinn call back? No. No texts either. Jerk. Hallie sighed. Jonah had said to do whatever it took to convince Quinn. That she was the only one who could talk him into coming and making this episode even more perfect. But what Quinn wanted Hallie to say was never coming out of her mouth. Like with Hallie, Spies had given Quinn Holloway his career, but he wouldn't even consider how much he owed the show. Only what he felt like Hallie owed him.
Chapter 6. Bellamy handed Nash a stack of plates and pointed him to the dining room, where she was setting up the buffet dinner. The cast and crew that were staying at the ranch house would be in and out that evening, so she had the dishes in warmers on the long, skinny table at the far side of the dining room. I thought my dinner was free and clear of any work. Don't you have employees? He asked, using his hips to open the swinging door between the kitchen and the short hallway that led into the dining room. Yes. Bellamy had grabbed a pan full of chicken and dumplings and followed him out. But they're upstairs cleaning. Everyone here has crazy schedules, so we've been getting into the rooms to straighten up whenever we can. Dee, I mean Ms. St. Martin, wants her sheets washed every day. She widened her eyes at Nash as she set down the pan, and Nash grimaced at the added work to the already overworked, small ranch house staff. Many of them were seasonal, and Bellamy's mother hadn't come back from Arizona yet to do the summer cooking. Bellamy probably could have coaxed her up north early to help with the she spies guests, but in Bellamy's words, since her fiancé, Coy, was too busy with basketball finals, she didn't have anything else to do but wait on the cast anyway. The chicken and dumplings dish was the one comfort food out among a line of lighter fare, salads, fresh asparagus, the fixings for fish taco bowls with halibut, and even something that Nash suspected might be quinoa. It surprised him Bellamy had deigned to cook it. It was her second worst food swear word. He set the plates next to the small sign that read, "Fresh smoothies made to order." He followed Bellamy back in for a few more items and then she shooed him out to eat. "You're probably the only one who'll eat my dumplings, and you should have them while they're still hot." He obeyed. Bellamy's chicken and dumplings was the closest thing to heaven on earth. He had just settled down with a big bowl of it at the table when Hallie, Ms. Butler, walked in. He'd told her to call him Nash, and their conversation on set today was casual like they'd become friends, but he wasn't quite sure if he should call her by her first name. He didn't want to make presumptions about their friendship and be one of those fans. "Hey there." She smiled and strode into the dining room, her eyes widening when she looked down at his bowl. "That smells divine." She closed her eyes and inhaled as she came closer, putting two hands on the back of the chair next to Nash. "You should have some." He pointed to the table full of dinner foods. "Bellamy's a crazy good cook, and chicken and dumplings is the best thing she makes." He turned sideways in his chair to chat with the actress. Rumor is Taggart Dubois's wife craved it during her entire pregnancy. A corner of Hallie's lips turned up in a smirk and removed all of Nash's ability to think of her as Ms. Butler. She had small lips, but they were full in the middle and shaped like a heart. He'd watched the way she mouthed a few words as she read her Doug Robbins novel that morning, and they'd been on his mind ever since. "Taggart Dubois's wife, as in your ex, Roxy?" she asked, tilting her head at him. Nash frowned at her. "How do you know that?" he asked. The cast hadn't been in town long enough for that gossip, had they? Bellamy told Coy on one of the episodes of Catch. "You also dated the owner of the diner." Her smile grew with every word. "It's a small town," he said dryly. Bellamy had such a big mouth. It was a wonder the Catch producers had trusted her not to spill everything about the show before it aired. And all the behind-the-scenes stuff too. The contract must have been scary, because she'd managed not to give away too much in the interviews of what had really happened between her and Coy during the season and how he'd never fallen for Charlotte despite the editing to make it look as though he had. Nash stood up. "Can I get you some dumplings?" he asked. Hallie turned and eyed the food spread out, her gaze stopping on the end with the fresh spinach, corn salsa, and blackened seasoned halibut for the taco bowls. Her lips turned from the smirk into a tiny frown. "Sure," she finally said. "But make it small." She slipped into the chair next to Nash's. He picked up one of the mug bowls that Bellamy had set out and put a scoop and a half of the soup into the bowl, making sure to include plenty of chicken, while still honoring Hallie's wishes. He knew she couldn't make a habit of the rich, creamy soup and stay in the toned shape she had to for her role on Spies. "Anything else?" he asked after setting down the mug and a spoon in front of her. "I didn't realize you worked here too." Hallie picked up her spoon and eyed Nash. "But the asparagus and a salad look good." Nash forced a chuckle, pushing away embarrassment at how eager he must be coming off. She was gorgeous. He knew this. He watched her show religiously. But she was nice, and the things she'd said about his script meant something to him. That she thought he'd stayed true to her character and the world she worked hard to represent every week made her twice as beautiful. Basically, he was lucky he could keep from staring with his mouth hanging open. "I am your stalker. It's the least I can do to bring you food." He set the plate in front of her and slid back into his own seat. "Do you come out here to eat often? Is that a thing in town usually?" Hallie asked before she put the first bite of chicken and dumplings in her mouth. She moaned. "Of course you do. Everybody must, right? There aren't words. At least not appropriate ones." Nash snorted at her description, glad he hadn't taken another bite of his own yet. "Roxy flew Bellamy out to Nashville one weekend just to make these dumplings." Hallie nodded slowly, taking another bite instead of replying. But she studied him while she ate, so he turned his attention to his own food for a moment to avoid her scrutinizing gaze. "So you're tight with Roxy's best friend?" If it weren't for Bellamy's obvious adoration of Coy Jones, I'd wonder if there was something going on with you and Bellamy. "You know, small towns and all. Bellamy and I bonded over he spies, she spies. We kept watching even after Roxy and I broke up. Bellamy missed Roxy when she traveled with Tag, and I probably did a little bit too." He took a deep breath. "Roxy and I were good friends, and we probably shouldn't have made it more. Or maybe we should have, and she was just in my path to my right someone. Someday." Hallie took another bite of the soup, still studying him. "You are a writer," she said when she swallowed. "That was really nice." She frowned down into her mug, which was empty, and then pushed it away. "So was that," she murmured, picking up her fork and scooting the plate of vegetables in front of her. "Bellamy could package that stuff and be a millionaire, I'm sure." Nash almost felt guilty for finishing the rest of his bowl. They ate in silence for a few moments. "So, they want to get Quinn Holloway back for this episode?" Hallie nodded, glaring at her plate. "Because of Quinn or because it wasn't chicken and dumplings? Did they tell you in the meeting?" "They talked a lot about how they wanted to keep stuff and if there was a chance Quinn would come back." It was Nash's turn to study Hallie. "There's only one way to get Quinn back," she said. She sat up straighter in the chair, and the amusement that had been dancing through her expression for most of the conversation had drained away. "That's for me to grovel, and I don't know if I can." Grovel? Even though his bowl had been much larger, he found himself pretty disappointed as well that his was now gone. He reached for Hallie's mug and took them over to the bin Bellamy had set out for dirty dishes. Normally he'd take them into the kitchen for her, but he wanted to sit and talk with Hallie more. "Quinn left the show because of me. Best kept secret of Spies." She didn't look up at Nash as he slid back into his seat. Nash didn't know Hallie very well and he tried hard not to put Mallory Ryder's personality on her. But she seemed just as kind as her character, so he couldn't help wondering what kind of jerk Quinn Holloway was if he couldn't get along with her. "You're killer talented then, because your chemistry on the show is good." That got a smile from her. We got along fine. Actually really good. We were best friends. Friends? Nash couldn't help questioning it. Quinn and Hallie had kissed plenty of times over the last few years on the show and had more than a few steamy scenes. If they were already best friends, how did they keep that from turning into more? What happened? He tried to keep the curiosity from his voice, but Hallie let out a laugh. You want to know if it was more than friends, she said. Nash shook his head, but Hallie held up a hand. I deserve it after those comments about you and Roxy and the diner owner and Bellamy. Yes, it could have been. She took a deep breath and speared one of her asparagus. It's a talent that Bellamy even made these pretty delicious. Nash nodded his agreement instead of answering. He wanted Hallie to go on about how it could have been more with her and Quinn Holloway. He asked me to make it more. Last season, after the fake marriage episode, she said. Yeah, Nash couldn't help interjecting now. It had been a good episode. Mallory and Declan on a mission in honeymoon hotspot Aruba and doing the whole pretend relationship thing. Only it wasn't so fake, and it got Declan thinking about the future. That could have been symbolic of our relationship. Everything right below the surface, both of us scared to say something. And then suddenly you're playing house and it feels right. Hallie stirred her fork around in her salad, staring at it and avoiding Nash's gaze. His chest clenched, and he tried to shove the jealousy away. He'd only known Hallie for a couple days, and they'd chatted for barely an hour if he counted both instances. But he had a crush, and it looked ridiculous up next to Quinn Holloway and the fact that they were friends and had history and chemistry he'd been watching for almost 4 years now. I'm trying but I can't put these pieces together. Nash smiled at her and leaned an elbow on the table. You guys were best friends, you both had a moment during that episode, and then he left the show because of you. She chuckled. You're missing one piece. She looked up at him again, copying his posture and leaning her own elbow on the table. When he wanted to make it real, I said no. We had a good thing, the show, our friendship, and I didn't want to screw it up. So he didn't want to stay. I'm guessing he thought you chose the show over him, he said. Exactly. She straightened and turned back to her salad. So groveling includes telling him I was wrong and opening up the possibility of a relationship with him, even though that's not what I want. She sighed. But to save the show. Was the show more important? He shook his head as he realized how presumptuous it was of him to ask. I'm sorry. You don't owe me that answer. No matter what you know about Roxy and Addie. We got personal fast. Hallie grinned at him. Well, he pointed at himself, stalker. Job hazard, I guess. She burst into laughter and pushed away the salad. The show is my safety net. The show is the thing I know I'm good at. I don't know if I'd be good at a relationship, especially in Hollywood. And I don't know if I'd be good at one with Quinn, even if things did feel right. It was too much of a risk. And now you have to take it to get Quinn back because that's what the producers want. Nash studied the table, running his finger along one of the grains. I feel like that's my fault. No, she waved her hand at him when he looked up. They've wanted Quinn to come back since he left, and by the final episode, they would have been asking this. The fans want to tie up Spies with a pretty Declan and Mallory bow, and I don't blame them. I'm finding myself less and less into the Declan and Mallory bow, he said. Hallie had turned in her chair to face him, and she scooted closer now so that her knees were brushing the side of his leg. Dr. Nash, does that mean you like me some? She asked in a quiet voice. He smiled back, the way she had when he'd asked earlier that day. He definitely liked hanging out with her. He liked that she'd praised his work. He liked that she trusted him with some personal stuff, even if it did reveal that she might have feelings for her co-star. Then it hit him. You've read all of the Doug Robbins books, right? She arched an eyebrow at him. Is that like a prerequisite for dating you? Nash stuck with the flirtatious bravado he'd been using so far. Yes. Then my answer is yes, I've read every single one. She leaned in closer. You remember the book where Dunn needs Emmeline's help on a case but he doesn't want her back in his dangerous life? Now Nash was leaning over too. And he pretends to have a girlfriend, Hallie finished for him. I take it you're volunteering to be Sabrina Jackson. It's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for my favorite show. Hallie smirked. Stalker.
Chapter 7. Hallie scrolled through the messages on her phone as she waited on the tiny plane at the tiny airport in Casper. Then she scrolled back up to the top to the messages she and Nash had teasingly traded back and forth to create their backstory. Not that she would ever show them to Quinn. They were far too cheesy to be believable anyway. Hallie grinned as she added another one. Headed back to LA for the night. Miss me already? It was almost time for the plane to take off before she got an answer back. I can see why you're so good at what you do. Always in character. She laughed to herself as she read it, and then the next one came. Going to talk to Quinn? He followed this with a grimacing emoji. You should have brought me with you. For emotional support. And to keep our story up. And also for the beach. She should have brought Nash along. It would have been fun and nice to have someone to dump her problems on after talking to Quinn. Nash had been great at listening, balancing the serious with lighter moments to help her feel better. The chemistry with him was as easy as it had been with Quinn during those first few screen tests. Plus Nash liked Doug Robbins' books. It helped that he was also kind of obsessed with her show, but he'd also shown that he could separate who she was on screen and who she was in real life. He hadn't once slipped and called her Mallory, which gave him bonus points even above Quinn. Although that might have been a job hazard for him. Or him immersing himself in character. Weekend trip together, this is moving fast. She added a winking face so he'd know she was teasing. Every once in a while, since they'd spoken 2 nights before, pink would rise in his cheeks in a sweet blush she found endearing. Was he doing that now as he read her texts? She liked picturing it. The flight attendant made Hallie turn her phone to airplane mode before she got another answer from Nash, and something must have happened at the clinic since there wasn't a response when she landed for her connection in Denver. She had just touched down in LA when she got his text. It doesn't have to mean anything too serious. I'm mostly interested in the beaches. Her snort of laughter made the businessman in the seat across the aisle from her turn and look at her. Then smile in recognition. She pretended not to get his recognition and stood for her carry-on bag. She'd already convinced Quinn to meet her for dinner, so she stopped at her condo in Silver Lake just long enough to change before the driver she'd hired arrived to take her into LA. Quinn stood when she approached the table, his slim-cut, navy suit reminding her of plenty of other dinners. Of plenty of scenes when she'd admired how hot he was, especially when he did a fight scene in the same suit and executed many of his own stunts. Of plenty of evenings when they'd sit next to each other on some prop couch and hang out in crazy clothes like tuxes and evening dresses. Of falling for him. He leaned over and kissed her on the cheek, his eyes soft, probably mirroring hers, when he pulled away. It's so good to see you, Hal. Thanks for meeting me. They held each other's hands for a long moment before Quinn moved around the back of her chair to hold it for her while she sat down. In a nearby window, a flash went off. She ignored it. Let people speculate about why she was meeting up with Quinn. Maybe a social media storm of Spies fans begging would help soften Quinn's heart this time. So, he said when he'd taken the chair across from her. They sent you here to sweet-talk me? They did. Hallie wasn't going to lie to him. Well, except for the part about dating Nash. But that was just a little lie. A few more days with him in that cute little town and she might actually be dating him. But I came to apologize too. Quinn's eyebrows arched. For not believing in you. Pushing you away because I was scared. She fiddled with her fingers in her lap. She meant her apology and should have said all of this to Quinn before he'd left. He probably still would have gone because she still couldn't do what he'd asked of her. For making the show more important than us? He studied her, hurt darting back through his expression. That too. She squeezed her fingers tighter. Quinn was never going to do this. He'd left because he couldn't be with her every day and not be with her. He couldn't see her every day and remember how she'd broken his heart. I'm sorry, she said again. You're willing to give us a chance to save the show? Skepticism filled his statement, like he saw through her apology. I meant it. I am sorry. I got scared about how wrong everything could go. That wasn't fair to you. If you still won't come back, I understand. But it's not fair that you're putting so many careers in jeopardy because we can't agree on something. She put her hands on the table and leaned forward. Those words sounded a lot like what she'd said before, but hopefully he'd be more receptive now that she'd admitted to her fear holding her back. Quinn gave a soft, scoffing laugh and sat back in his seat. So you're still more worried about the show than me, he accused. I'm seeing someone, Hallie blurted. Shock dropped across Quinn's expression, and then hurt again. He's, actually the person who helped me to understand why I freaked out. Another small lie. Nash did know about all that. He had talked about it with her. So, you weren't planning on coming here and telling me we should give it a go to get me to come back? He rubbed the back of his neck and then squinted as he studied her. That wouldn't be fair to either of us. She picked up her napkin and draped it over her lap to have something else to grip besides her poor fingers. Jonah said he sent you the script. It's good, Quinn. Really good. She took a deep breath to dive into the story she and Nash had worked out. Nash, my boyfriend, he wrote it. I thought it was a contest winner. Quinn scowled at her and picked up his menu, hiding behind it. It was. I made him submit it. She picked up her own menu. Why didn't you show it to Jonah yourself? Hallie bit back a small smile as she remembered the story Nash had told her about Bellamy entering the contest for him and accepting the prize as his assistant. He wouldn't enter. He didn't want to get favors because he was dating me. Quinn gave a soft oomph and looked back at his menu. It is good, he said quietly. It is the perfect way to bring Declan back without him compromising the decision he made to leave the agency. He gave Hallie a pointed look over his menu. I understand. She laid her menu down. There was no point in continuing this dinner. She didn't have anything left to say to Quinn. She couldn't start dating him just to save the show. She couldn't start dating him just because she missed him. She couldn't start missing him because she was still afraid that he'd rip her heart out one way or another. Nobody survived relationships in the Hollywood gossip mill. I really am sorry, she said, picking up her clutch from the table and moving to stand. I'll do it. Quinn dropped his menu on the table. What? Hallie scowled. A minute ago he'd been sure she'd apologize to lure him back to the show, and now that was it? He'd do it? It was her turn to gaze at him with her eyebrows turned down in skepticism. I'll come. Tell Wendy to send my assistant your flight information, and I'll fly back with you. We can run lines. He smiled at her, but it looked very Declan. Hallie narrowed her eyes. Sure. I'll text her now. His smile widened. Good. So, let's start you off with some good coffee because I doubt that little place has any of that. Addie's coffee was really good. A lot of things about that town were really good. Actually, and is it a salad night or a steak night? Hallie thought of that heavenly chicken and dumplings she'd eaten at the ranch house. Salad. She sighed.
Chapter 8. Nash had been thinking pretty much non-stop about how to add a beach scene into the novel he had planned on his computer. The problem was, he kept coming up with good beach scenes for He Spies, She Spies. None of them involved Mallory Ryder anywhere near Declan while on the beach. They involved Nash taking Jonah welling up on doing a bit part even though Nash would be horrible at it. Mallory uses handsome doctor on the beach to flirt and distract her mark. I knocked for like 5 minutes. A voice broke Nash out of his thoughts, and he looked up to see his friend, Wyatt, standing in front of him, holding a pizza box. Also, I told you to move your hidden key. No one is fooled by that fairy garden on your porch. Wyatt dropped the pizza on the coffee table and reached for the remote. My mom gave that to me. Nash set aside his laptop. He'd forgotten that he and Wyatt had made plans to watch the Mountaineers game. He'd texted Bellamy to ask if she wanted to come over too, but she'd said she had to stick around the ranch house in case any of her high-maintenance guests needed anything. They probably should have offered to go out there. Maybe at halftime. Bellamy would make fun of their pizza. She was always critiquing the crust of the local pizza place. You're a doctor. People are going to break in, thinking you have drugs. Wyatt fixed Nash with a stern glare. Don't make me respond to a crime scene at your house. Nash held up his hands in surrender. You're right, man. Sorry. Got any suggestions? He hopped up to grab plates from the kitchen and a few napkins. Give it to your mom. She only lives like 3 streets over. Wyatt had already lifted a slice of the supreme pizza out by the time Nash came back with the dinnerware. Wyatt plopped his piece onto the plate, then leaned back in the chair and flipped through channels to find the game. And when I forget my key after a 2 a.m. call-out? Your mom will probably just be happy you took the opportunity to come see her. Wyatt chuckled. Fair. How's the filming going? Wyatt asked. Not as bad as I thought it would be. Nash dished out a couple slices onto his plate before kicking his feet up on the coffee table. Wyatt smirked. The gorgeous leading actress flirting with you helps, I bet. A little. He thought about the texts Hallie had sent him after meeting with Quinn, recounting how quickly he'd agreed to come back and how it had raised her suspicions. Any chance he suspects your story about us is fake? Nash had asked. How could he? He's not an actual spy. It had led to several minutes of them texting outrageous scenarios where dating a spy turned out to be a bad idea. Any chance it could turn out to be real? Wyatt asked, surprising Nash out of his thoughts. Real? He repeated, his insides tightening as he tried to figure out how Wyatt would know about his deal with Hallie. He hadn't told anyone, and he didn't imagine she'd let gossip get around either. That would defeat the whole purpose. Wyatt busied himself with his pizza, avoiding Nash's gaze with an air of guilt. Yeah, like more than flirting while she's in town. Nash broke into a laugh, mostly of relief. No. Maybe a fling, he added to cover whatever Wyatt might hear later. But nothing real. Wyatt's expression relaxed, his embarrassment, maybe at probing for Nash's feelings, fading. You never know. Tag and Roxy, Bellamy meeting Coy, the Miller girl ending up with Drew North. Mrs. Townsend says there's magic here. Wyatt's voice dripped with sarcasm over the concept. Nash only laughed and settled in to watch the game. Tag and Roxy had been high school sweethearts, and Coy had practically been thrown in Bellamy's lap for that show. And with the ranch house catering to stars like Drew North and a rumored Hemsworth, perhaps a few more happily ever afters were in store for the regular folks of Little River and the high-rolling tourists that kept showing up. Nash was pretty sure that wasn't in the cards for him and Hallie. When filming resumed Tuesday afternoon, Hallie texted that Nash should come down to the set the next time he had a few minutes. That few minutes didn't happen until after 7, at which point she texted that they were shooting out at the AA cabin on the ranch. Nash dropped by the ranch house and grabbed a to-go box of dinner for him and Hallie before driving over. When he pulled up alongside the myriad of vehicles and caught sight of Quinn Holloway kissing Hallie, he almost decided to call Wendy over to his Jeep and hand her Hallie's dinner. Instead, he reminded himself that he'd seen Hallie kiss Quinn hundreds of times on She Spies, and that Nash wasn't actually dating her. No reason to get jealous. He pushed the door of his Jeep open, slid out, and grabbed her dinner for her before sauntering over to stand behind Mr. Welling. The man was grinning so wide Nash didn't think they needed the extra lighting. "It's perfect, Nash." Mr. Welling twisted in his seat. "So much better than the alternate we came up with." He clapped and shouted some directions, not waiting for any reaction from Nash. Some of the knots in Nash's stomach untwisted. Bit by bit, these people might convince him that it wasn't crazy to have written a script about a show he was obsessed with. He shouldn't have put that one really great, emotional kissing scene in. Especially since it looked like Hallie and Quinn had done several takes, and Quinn was obviously enjoying it. His hands gripped Hallie's waist and he lifted her off her toes at the same time she wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled herself closer. "Friends." He rolled his eyes and stared at the ground. That's what Nash and Hallie were, not what Quinn and Hallie were, no matter how much she protested it. She might be scared of what would happen between her and Quinn and if it could last, but the chemistry was still there. It had always been there. "Nash." Her voice brought his gaze up, and she hurried over to him, throwing her arms around him the same way she'd thrown them around Quinn moments earlier. "I brought dinner." Heat pulsed in his cheeks, and despite his earlier jealousy, his free hand wrapped around her back so instinctively it was almost like he was an actor. Only he wasn't acting. He tried to cover his teenaged reaction to her by dropping a kiss on her cheek. When he pulled away, Hallie slid her fingers along his hairline and tilted his head down, then leaned up and kissed him. On the lips. It was milliseconds before Nash got over the surprise and responded, pulling her tighter against him with his hand resting on her back, wishing he didn't have the stupid to-go box in his other hand. "I missed you," Hallie murmured. Nash swallowed and pressed his lips against her ear. "I'm a really bad actor, and you are a far better one." She laughed softly. "You did great." He almost repeated that he was a really bad actor. "You must be the script magician Hallie and Jonah can't stop talking about." Quinn Holloway had stopped a few feet away from them, his lips turned up in a smile but his eyes narrowed at Nash. "Amateur writer. The rest of the time I'm Dr. Roberts." He knew it sounded pretentious, but it was too late to take it back now. He kept a hand on Hallie's back. She clearly wanted him to go all out with his act, so he'd oblige her on that. Hallie was his friend, and he could do this for her. He just had to get a grip on his growing feelings for her. Quinn's eyes widened in surprise the same way Hallie's had when she found out he wasn't some basement-dwelling nerd with a shrine to her in his closet. "Oh. Yeah, that's cool. How'd filming go?" Nash asked. He didn't want either Quinn or Hallie to think he was bothered by the makeout session he'd walked up on. "Pretty good," Hallie said with a shrug the same time Quinn replied, "Perfect. Just like old times." He finished with a wink in Hallie's direction. "Good, good." Nash forced himself to smile at Hallie. "I'm glad. Can't help liking the fact that my script gets to shine in its original glory." Had Nash emphasized script? His jealousy was rearing its head again. No use pointing out to Quinn that the scene he'd enacted was pretend when Nash's whole relationship with Hallie was also pretend. "I have to admit," Quinn said, the confident smile never sliding off his expression, "you nailed the banter between Declan and Mallory. I've been enjoying myself." He gave a laugh, leaning forward to slap Nash on the shoulder. Nash wished he could just take in the compliment and not the insinuation. "Thanks," he said with a nod. His smile was not as easy as Quinn's. Nash could feel the stiffness in it. Thankfully Hallie interrupted. "Can we eat in your Jeep? I need some quiet." She turned her back on Quinn and grabbed her dinner from Nash. "Sure." Nash slid his hand down into hers in a move that felt far too natural. He waved at Quinn. "Cool to meet you, man." Then he pulled Hallie away, trying not to like it too much when she leaned into him as they walked back to his Jeep. "You keep saying you're not an actor, but you did the jealousy back there pretty well." She quirked an eyebrow at him, and he couldn't help the heat that raced to his cheeks. "I might be slightly intimidated by the very muscled, very successful actor who was kissing you when I walked up," he admitted. She pressed her lips together but grinned up at him. "You remember how most mothers want their sons to grow up to be doctors, right?" she teased. "So, the scene went well," he said instead of responding, making her laugh. He opened the passenger side door for her when they arrived at his Jeep, holding her to-go box while she climbed in. "Come on, get in and eat with me." She waved to the styrofoam container he'd left on his center console. "You'll be jealous of the burger." He leaned against the door frame and a few more knots loosened. He liked Hallie Butler too much. She was an actress. It was crazy to think they could have anything beyond the game they were playing now, even if there was a spark between them that he was pretty sure rivaled anything on screen she had with Quinn. Which he could at least say was different than the easy familiarity he'd shared with Roxy. There was tension here he couldn't quite get rid of, and like Roxy had accused him of lacking before, a need to be with Hallie that outweighed anything he'd ever felt. "You'll give me a bite." Hallie beamed at him and pulled one of the zucchini fries out of her container. "These smell really good." "They are." Nash had snuck a few from his container on the way over. He finally shut her door and rounded the Jeep, climbing up into his side and opening his own container. "You shouldn't be so surprised that this is going well." Hallie waved out the windshield to the shots they were filming of Quinn. "Your script is amazing. Have you written anything else like it?" "I'm too embarrassed to answer that truthfully." He took a bite of his hamburger. "You have." Hallie's expression lit up as she popped another zucchini fry into her mouth. "Can I read them?" "No. Totally not. The one Bellamy submitted to the contest was definitely my best." Nash put down his burger, since the thought of Hallie reading any of his other scripts made his stomach twist right back up again. "If you never intend anyone to read your Spies scripts, how are you going to become the next Doug Robbins?" She sat back against the car door, scrutinizing him the same way she had back at the ranch house a few nights before. "A novel." He let loose plenty of obviously into that statement. "Have you started?" she asked. "I have an outline. I've taken some online classes and read a few books, but I have so much more to learn before I'm ready to write an actual novel." He tapped his fingers against the steering wheel and his gaze went back to Quinn Holloway, who appeared to be beating an extra to a pulp in the scene they were filming where Declan lost control to get to Mallory. Sheesh, the guy had some impressive biceps. "If your script is any indication, I think it's time to put on your big boy pants and write your novel. Doug Robbins is going to be wishing he was you." Hallie reached across the console to put her hand on his arm. He turned back to her. "You're just saying that because you're my girlfriend." She laughed, but then shook her head. "Facts, Nash Roberts. Facts." Nash stuck around to watch them film a little longer before he headed back by the ranch house on his way home. Hallie had kissed him goodbye when he left, and when they pulled away, Nash hadn't missed the way Quinn glared at Hallie's back. The whole thing wasn't fair to the guy, but the longer Nash had Hallie's fingers threaded through his, the less he cared. Especially since Quinn had made it clear earlier that he didn't mind flirting with Hallie on and off set. Besides, something had held Hallie back last year, something still held her back now. Maybe it was fear of the risk it would be to have a relationship with a fellow actor. But maybe now it was that she recognized the possibility that there was something beyond the fake relationship between her and Nash. Bellamy was pacing alongside the table in the dining room, on the phone when he came in, so he shut the door softly. She was probably on the phone with Coy, and he didn't want to disturb her. Since she'd submitted his script and then accepted being the winner on his behalf, her guilt had driven her to a lot of things, and he didn't want that to extend to an obligation to hang out with him over talking with her fiancé. They were leaning in close and telling each other about all sorts of things. "I really do think there's something there," Bellamy was saying. And coy or not, Nash knew she was talking about him and Hallie at dinner a few nights earlier. He cleared his throat. Bellamy spun around, her eyes widening. I'll talk to you later, Rox." She quickly hung up. Nash glared at the ceiling and let out a long sigh. "Were you seriously gossiping about me and Hallie to Roxy? You and a very famous actress are hitting it off, and that's big news, and she's my best friend." Bellamy put a hand on her hip in defiance, but the multiple times she shrugged one shoulder said she wasn't quite so chill as she appeared. "To Roxy? That's weird." "Is it so weird that she selfishly wants to make sure that she didn't break you beyond fixing? You told her it was okay for her to go after Tag, but you haven't dated in forever and everyone knows that." "Roxy didn't have to hear it from me," she added in a rush when Nash scowled at her. "She's been worried." "That doesn't make any of this better. I'm fine. Roxy was right about us, and I've definitely dated." Nash dropped onto the couch he stood in front of. Bellamy arched a brow. "Who? Why don't you ask around town? I'm sure somebody can fill you in." It was an immature shot, but Nash didn't have a satisfactory answer for her anyway. Besides, it was none of her or Roxy's business if he did or did not date. And before you let Roxy or the rest of the town imagine too much, you should know that this thing between Hallie and me is fake. Totally fake. She doesn't want to date Quinn right now, and I'm like the buffer. Bellamy put her other hand on her hip. "That's so not what it looked like a few nights ago. We both know Hallie is a great actress." Nash folded his arms. "We both know that you're not." He shrugged. "So I'll enjoy this fling in my 15 minutes of fame, and it will be fine when she leaves, because even if this was real, Hallie Butler is not staying in Little River forever, and she's way too famous for someone like me." The same could be said for Coy Jones or Taggart Du Bois or Drew North, and yet, Bellamy eyed him for a long time. He shook his head, and she rolled her eyes. "Fine. Whatever. Want some pie?" Nash pushed himself off the couch. The answer to that question is always yes.
Chapter 9. Hallie tried to be upset about the picture of her and Nash chatting in front of the diner that had been leaked to the online celebrity gossip magazine, TV Tatler. He was smiling at her and leaning forward, so it had probably been snapped when he'd asked if she liked him some. And she was grinning back like a smitten kitten. But she liked it, and every comment on the post so far, according to Wendy, since Hallie didn't read that stuff, couldn't stop gushing about Hallie Butler's adorable small-town romance with the Rags to Riches contest winner, Robert Nash. She snort-laughed softly at the silly name. She dialed his number on her phone, crossing her fingers he'd answer. At first she thought all his talk about being too busy for all the promo stuff was him trying to get out of it, but his doctor life did keep him very busy. "This is Dr. Roberts." "This is Ms. Butler." Nash chuckled at her greeting and Hallie suppressed a giggle of her own. This man made her feel so light and everything was just fun. While her relationship with Quinn had been good, worry of going further had permeated too much for her to enjoy it. "How can I help you, Ms. Butler?" "I'm afraid I just have a couple minutes before a patient expects me in an exam room." "Fine. Fine. I'll forego all the flirting and get right to the point. Believe me, I'm as sorry as you to miss out on that." There's a picture of us online and a lot of speculation. Are you okay with that? I can have the publicist squash stuff immediately. Hallie tapped her fingers along the arm of her chair. Isn't the whole point to convince Quinn? What would he think if your publicist denies that there's anything going on? The light tone disappeared from his voice, replaced with concern that had butterflies swarming almost as much as his words from before. He'd understand that we were keeping it between us right now. I know how worried you were about it getting around that you did this script. He laughed again. I think we're beyond that now. How do you feel about it? The same excitement that fueled Hallie's fight scenes as Mallory Ryder trickled through her now. He'd been so kind about what she needed from the moment they met, and it contrasted sharply with what had felt like Quinn making demands of her. She should have sacrificed for them, but he hadn't even considered how difficult that would be for her before he walked out. I like it. She gave a soft laugh. It's good for my image and for the show. People are getting interested, like Jonah knew they would, with the contest hype. And the possibility that the winner and I might have a thing? It's too good to resist. Then I'm good with it. I know how much this show means to you. He cleared his throat, and Hallie warmed at the idea that he might be embarrassed over caring for her. You're a good man, Nash. One of the best. He forced another laugh. Thanks. I do have to go though. See you later? This time when he said it, he didn't hesitate over the idea that they would. If you're a good boyfriend, yes. That's the goal. Nash hung up. Wendy strolled up beside her. If you don't stop staring at the phone all giddy like that, people are gonna think you like this guy. She plucked the phone from Hallie's hands. They're ready for your scene. I do like this guy, Hallie murmured. Enough that once they were done filming and Spies was back in the running to get another season, she might want to see if Nash would consider making this thing real. Or at least admitting that this thing was real. She strolled into the hotel with a giddy smirk still plastered on her face. Quinn slid an arm around her waist as soon as she walked onto the set. I see you're as excited as I am about working together this afternoon. He tugged her closer. Hallie stiffened. Before he'd left, this had been the kind of flirting that happened between them all the time. So maybe Nash wasn't as much of a distraction for Quinn as Hallie had hoped. At least she could push off any pressure that they get together. You know how much I've always loved working on this show. She tried to put a few inches between them. With me, he insisted. She shoved him away playfully. Let's get to work. Hey, Hal. Hallie sat straight up from where she'd been napping on a prop couch in the hotel room they'd filmed in off and on the last few days, blinking in surprise. Did you read that script I emailed you a couple days ago? Jonah looked up from his tablet only when he stood right in front of her. He grimaced. Sorry, didn't realize you were sleeping. Hallie collapsed back against the arm of the couch and threw an arm over her eyes. Just something quick. And yeah, I stayed up last night reading it. After she'd spent a few hours hanging out with Nash. She bit back a smile. Yeah, that was time she should have been spending on the scripts Jonah kept bringing her, looking out for something just in case. But Nash was far more tempting. His plan to make her his fake girlfriend was genius. Now she needed a plan to tell him her feelings weren't so fake. And? Jonah asked. You liked it? The look on your face says you liked it. She sat up and tried not to smile so much. It's good, yeah. Jonah scowled. But? It's a crime procedural, pretty much what I've been doing. People are gonna think I'm redoing Spies in New York City. She rubbed at her forehead. I need something different. Jonah didn't answer for a long time. Long enough that Hallie turned to stare at him. Jonah? There are a lot of people asking for you, Jonah said, holding his tablet in one hand and dropping it to his side. Rumors are starting to spread, and like I told you, you're a commodity. 4 kick-butt detective parts. Jonah shrugged. You're good at that. I'm not asking for something clear out of that line, but something more unique than me and a partner falling in love while we solve crime. She stood up and stretched, glancing at her watch to see how much time she had before her next scene. You have any ideas? Jonah asked. Like what kind of different, Hal? Pitch me something. She blew out a breath. You know that's not my wheelhouse. Then go out and find something. Because this is what you're gonna get until you do. He saluted her with the tablet and turned to leave the room, probably to return to the lobby where they'd been shooting the last couple hours. She sank back onto the couch, telling herself she had 5 minutes to consider what Jonah had said. No one was thinking that Hallie was gonna be the next star of a family drama. So who did she know that could find Hallie's next big part, if it came to that? A grin broke across her face. She did know someone. He might not have a lot of pull in Hollywood, but he had a brilliantly creative mind. Nash. Nash could totally think of something.
Chapter 10. Nash's mom slid the mug of hot coffee across the table to him, and he smiled at the creamy brown liquid, more cream than he let himself put in, but just the way he liked it. He could guarantee that she'd added extra sugar and a splash of caramel syrup too. His mom was the go to fill in all across town and had spent her fair share of days taking orders at Addie's diner in a pinch. It showed in her coffee making. For a diner, Addie's place had the best coffee in town, and she had clearly taught Nash's mom her magic. He took a grateful sip. Thank you for being good to your word and coming by more, son, she said, sitting down across from him. You keep dosing me up on this stuff, and how can I stay away? Bet Addie would be happy to give you one-on-one lessons. His mom smirked from behind her own cup as she lifted it to her lips. Except I've been hearing some rumors about you and Miss Butler. Nash choked on his coffee, making his mom chuckle. Just a fling, Mom, he said. That'd be easiest to explain to people when their relationship ended after Hallie left. She scowled. A fling? Not likely to last. She's an actress, just in town for this. She's not going to up and decide she wants to live in Little River, and I can't see myself living in LA. He'd imagined it a couple times, actually, but he was pretty sure LA wasn't all beaches and warm weather. Traffic and a bunch of people figured in there as well. High cost of living. Those things tended to fade into the background when he thought about the very slim possibility of his fling with Hallie becoming real. What's she like? His mom took another sip and watched him. Sweet. A little insecure. Every time she brought up the possibility that she wouldn't find the right fit after Spies made him tempted to laugh at that thought. She was a gorgeous, successful actress. The only time he dared say something to that effect, she'd turned it right around on him, mocking the way he insisted that he couldn't write a novel. Capable. His mom swirled the liquid gently in her cup, a smile playing across her lips. What's that for? He asked. It sounds like you like her, she said. I never said I didn't. He shrugged. I'm being realistic. Maybe try being optimistic for once. She arched an eyebrow. For once. His eyebrows did the opposite, sliding downward into a scowl. Was that you being realistic when you stepped aside for Tag? She blinked at him with an innocent expression. I didn't exactly step aside, he muttered. Roxy had told him that they didn't have the zing she thought they should, and he hadn't fought her on that. But she'd been right. Roxy was meant to be with Tag. Maybe. His mom shrugged and didn't push it further. She'd gotten her point across. He could fight for Hallie. He drained the last of his cup. I've been meaning to get some writing done tonight, Mom. Do you mind? As long as you're not running away to avoid admitting something to me. She reached across the table. Think hard about it, okay? Promise me that. He stood and walked around the table, bending to kiss her cheek. I promise. 20 minutes later he sat down in front of his computer for the first time since the He Spies, She Spies cast and crew had shown up in Little River. The last week he'd either been working or hanging out with Hallie, flaunting their fake relationship to Quinn when Nash came on set and then sometimes going back to the ranch house or to Nash's or somewhere else in town and enjoying each other's company. The kissing and holding hands might only happen in front of Quinn, but Nash could definitely admit, at least to himself, that he enjoyed her private company far more now. Even if he wouldn't mind her private company including more of the kissing and holding hands. When he was being optimistic. Maybe he should admit that to his mom. He chuckled to himself. She might take that further than just his hopes for a future with Hallie. Spies was up in the mountains tonight, though, filming some scenes, and Nash hadn't gotten off work early enough to make it worth his time to drive up and check it out. He avoided logging on to any of his social media accounts, since most of them had been inundated with questions about his relationship with Hallie. He'd long since begged his assistant to address it, although he should probably stop guilting Bellamy into stuff like that. He'd stopped regretting that she'd entered the contest and brought Hallie into his life. He didn't even care anymore that she'd shared his private script. Little by little he'd come to believe it was good and that writing fanfic was more than a silly pastime. Besides, these days, even his everyday life meant answering questions about him and Hallie. He logged into the Spies fan website where he'd first started browsing the fan fiction to help him de-stress after bad days at the clinic. He opened a couple short stories to read, looking at them with new eyes now. They weren't a secret, guilty pleasure he shared with these people anymore. Instead he saw what Hallie saw in his script, stories that were true to the Spies world, stories that followed Mallory's character motivations and Declan's quirks. Good writing that could fit into the show's world as well as his script had. He closed out the page and opened up his word processor, opening his outline file and a blank document. Then he started writing his novel. A couple hours later, a text from Hallie brought him out of the writing zone, and before he answered he glanced down at the box at the bottom of the document he worked on. 3,500 words. He grinned as he scrubbed a hand through his hair and stood up, stretching out his stiff shoulders. He couldn't believe how well the words had flowed, like when he was writing his scripts. Too late for coffee at the diner? Hallie asked. Nash glanced at his watch. Nearly midnight. Addie would be closing up soon, and if there were no customers, she might already have locked the doors. Bet I could make that happen, he texted Hallie anyway. Then he shot off a text to Addie. Any chance you're still open and would stay open a little later for a big shot like Hallie Butler? It took a few minutes, but Addie replied, no, but I will for a big shot like Robert Nash. I will never forgive Bellamy for that. Addie replied with laughing emojis. An SUV idled in front of the diner when Nash pulled up. He hopped out of his Jeep to head over. Hallie stepped out as soon as he approached. Called in some favors. My newfound fame has come with some perks. He held open the diner door for her as she strode through. What will it be? Addie came from the kitchen as soon as the bell dinged above them. Is it too much to have a burger? Hallie put her hands together in a prayer-like pose. Of course not. What do you want on it? Lettuce and tomato. Condiments on the side. Addie turned to Nash. You. Coffee is fine. It's midnight. He raised an eyebrow at Hallie, who shrugged. Decaf, he added. He and Hallie took a booth and sat on opposite sides. I haven't eaten since before lunchtime, Hallie excused. How'd the scenes go? Nash leaned back into the corner of the booth and pushed away thoughts of Quinn flirting with Hallie all day long. She'd mentioned to him when they spoke on the phone earlier that day that he acted like he'd never left the show. Nash had already spent too much time today considering if her feelings had gone right back there too. Perfect, of course, Hallie answered. She tilted her head at him. You ever going to believe you wrote one heck of a script? You ever actually met a writer? Neurotic. The whole lot of you. She rolled her eyes. And what were you up to all night? Writing a novel. Hallie's eyes lit up, and she leaned over the table. Really? Can I see? He laughed. No. I only have like 3,000 words. She lowered herself back into the booth but still beamed at him. I bet they're 3,000 awesome words. Don't oversell it. Addie brought out Hallie's burger and 2 cups of coffee, setting them down before motioning around her. You two mind if I start closing up? Of course not, Hallie said in a rush. We don't want to keep you too long. Addie shrugged. Don't worry. I'd be here cleaning up until close to 1 anyway. Ben takes the mornings so I sleep in, she said of her brother, who she co-owned the diner with. She smiled at Nash and Hallie and then disappeared into the kitchen again. She's sweet, Hallie said, picking up her burger. She didn't add any of the condiments Addie had brought out, which seemed like a dry burger, but Nash didn't comment. Because she said a famous actress could sit here while she cleans up the diner? Nash asked. It's more than that. A good vibe. I'm a pretty good judge of character. I have to be to pick out the people who only hang out because of who I am. I don't get that vibe from her. Good choice. Nash tilted his coffee cup at her. Thank you. Why'd you guys break up? This made Nash laugh. Because we were in high school, and she wanted to date another guy. It was all very mature. He glanced around the diner to avoid Hallie's gaze and thought of the times he'd helped Addie close up back when they were dating. Laughing at the way she sang at the top of her lungs. Teasing her when she recleaned something he'd already done to make sure it was just right. When they'd broken up, he'd avoided the diner as much as he could. Gradually, after he moved back to town, it wasn't as awkward anymore. And after breaking up with Roxy, he'd come in frequently, if only to prove that he could be friends with Addie, so that he could prove that he could just be friends with Roxy, so he could prove that he didn't need the town's pity when she ran off after Tag. Seems like you should have fought harder. Hallie winked, but Hallie echoing his mom's statements from earlier struck at Nash the wrong way, especially on the heels of thinking about the good days with Addie. He had let Addie walk away, just like with Roxy. Why were his most serious relationships a string of him stepping aside for someone else? And at what point would that be what he did for Hallie too? Nash thought hard on this, even though it couldn't have been what his mom meant when she asked him to consider his feelings. She didn't know about Nash and Hallie's deal. But that's exactly how this would end up, him not fighting, again. Nash? I didn't mean, she lowered her burger to her plate, looking at him, concerned. He waved her away. It was high school. It's nothing anymore. Roxy broke up with you for someone else too, Hallie said softly. Just don't make it a pattern, he said, trying to make a joke, but their eyes met and held, and he couldn't laugh like he wanted. Maybe he didn't want to admit being optimistic to his mother, didn't want her to get her hopes up, but he had. He had thought about L.A. He had thought about Hallie here. He had thought about this being real between them even though that felt like a dream. Maybe it was the writer in him, the guy with the imagination figuring out a happy ending for a small-town doctor and a famous actress. Hallie scooted out of her side of the booth and slid in next to him. She put her arms around his neck, the way that she had the first night he brought her dinner on set. He glanced around the empty diner and then to the kitchen where muffled Taylor Swift music and the sound of Addie singing along filtered through. No one here to make a show for, he murmured. She leaned into him. That's what makes it so perfect. And before she'd even finished the sentence, she kissed him. She'd probably had a lot of practice and even more direction on how to kiss well. It showed, far more than it had any of the times they'd kissed, to make Quinn believe they were an actual couple. Her fingers moved up his neck, trailing a line of electricity that jolted through him. His own hands moved to her lower back, pulling her closer to him. Her breath caught and she gave a little gasp, which made Nash's arms tighten around her. This had been what Roxy was talking about. There was no niceness to this. This was not, "Honey, I'm home, how was your day?" This was don't ever leave me." This was distraction. His elbow bumped the table, rattling the silverware there and making them both laugh. He stared at Hallie for a moment. At her smile, at her blue eyes. At the pink in her cheeks and the bright red of her lips. And then he was too distracted by that to stare anymore. She parted her lips as he kissed her again, and then it didn't matter that they only had a sliver of space in the booth. "Sweet, freaking, cream," Hallie whispered even as they still kissed, and though most of Nash did not want to break the connection, he couldn't help the laugh that spilled out. "What?" "Bellamy said it once on the catch, and I find it so pertinent right now." Hallie kissed him again. "I feel like this is more of a holy chicken and dumplings kind of moment." He kissed behind her earlobe, and she let out a long sigh. "Amen. Let's leave so Addie can clean up." "You are brilliant. You keep saying that." Nash kept an arm around Hallie's waist as he dug out his wallet and threw some cash on the table, with a lot extra for the late night and any making out Addie might have been forced to witness, then pushed at Hallie to get them out of the booth. The SUV was gone, which was all the better. Nash held her hand as they walked to his Jeep and took her around to the driver's side, pressing her up against his Jeep for several more minutes of kissing. "This is real?" he asked when he pulled away. It felt so real, so much more real than anything he'd felt before, but he and Hallie had been playing around with this for too long for him to trust that instinct. She wrapped her arms around his waist and hugged herself to him as she looked up. So real.
Chapter 11. Hallie did not want to tell Nash she thought he should stay away from the final scenes they were shooting that day before everyone packed up and headed back to California. Especially since most of her day would be spent on set, and since she flew out the next morning, she didn't want to waste any time she could be spending with him. The night before, when they'd finally made it into Nash's Jeep, he'd taken her to 10 Falls, a pullout along the highway that led up into the mountains that he said was where all the cool couples went to make out. The view had been breathtaking even in the dark, tiny dots of lights in clusters all along the valley before her, but the moments there with Nash had stolen so much of her heart that she'd insisted on figuring out a weekend he could fly out to California as soon as possible. She'd been frustrated with the 15 minutes she had to wait to get service so she could look up flights. She'd forgotten all about asking him to come up with an idea for her. There would be plenty of time for that. She felt that deeply, and it made her chest nearly explode with the thought. True, they hadn't known each other very long, but Hallie knew about chemistry. She knew about what it took to make something succeed. She and Nash had it. Despite that most incredible evening with him and not dragging herself to her bed at the ranch house until almost 4 a.m., she did not want him to have to witness any more kissing between her and Quinn, especially if Quinn wasn't going to behave. She could separate herself from what was her job, but Nash was new to all this. Could he see that even if she and Quinn did have a past, nothing she'd ever shared came close to the thunderstorm that exploded inside her from the moment Nash touched her lips? 99% of the kisses she'd shared with Quinn had been planned out to every detail, to how she'd tilt her head and exactly where her pinky finger would rest against his shoulder. Nearly every one had been in front of dozens of witnesses. And even the one that hadn't been had scared Hallie speechless. It was all nothing to the way she couldn't keep her hands off Nash the night before. But he wouldn't be able to see that. He'd see Quinn. He'd see the guy she'd admitted to falling in love with but being scared to risk everything for. He'd see the guy she said was her best friend and the one Jonah and the producers raved about her chemistry with. He'd see someone millions of fans had shipped her with by the third episode of the first season. So when he called at 7 a.m. and began with, "I'm going to take the day off," she answered with a firm, "Ugh." "Hal. What's wrong?" "Well, you wrote this script, so you tell me if that's what you want to do." There was a long pause. "What scenes are you shooting?" "Outside the hotel after the big fight and rescue. The deserted road when Declan and Mallory say their goodbyes. And Mallory and Declan discussing their game plan at the diner." "Did Mr. Welling save every single kissing scene for today?" Nash asked. "There's no kissing at the diner." "I hate this episode." Hallie snickered. "You wrote this episode." "Yeah. It's as dumb as I always said it was. I'm trying to remember why I ever thought the show needed to bring Declan back. Mallory is a strong independent woman who doesn't need a man. Girls rule the world." A grin spread across her lips, and despite her serious lack of sleep, she thought she could probably hop up and run down the 10 blocks to Nash's house without breaking a sweat. "Preach, you think Mr. Welling would go for it? If it came from you? He'd think it was genius." "Okay, so I'm going to go to work. When are you shooting the diner scene?" Hallie's shoulders shook with suppressed laughter. "I'm sorry." He sighed. "It's my own fault." "I can't argue with that, but I'm glad all the same. I'll send you a text about the diner scene. It's scheduled for around lunchtime. The diner will be off limits to everyone else, but I bet we could convince Addie to make us something." "Sounds perfect. See you later?" "Later. For sure." And at that moment, Hallie sort of hated her job and the fact that she had to go act and kiss Quinn Holloway. "Mallory Ryder is a strong independent woman who doesn't need a man," she said as she marched to her spot 10 minutes later to begin filming. Jonah just laughed. Hallie let her wide eyes roam over the food Addie and Bellamy had set up on the side of the diner that wasn't being filmed in. They'd broken for lunch, so chatter had exploded, and the cast and crew had filled the diner tables as they waited for the meal to be ready to serve. "I can't even imagine how good this is going to taste with you two working together," Hallie breathed. She shot a forgive me look and snatched a fry from one of the baskets. It was so crisp and with the perfect seasonings. "Not me," Addie held up her hands and then pointed to the kitchen. "My cook, Jerry. He's the one that makes the magic. And I have to send my guests off with sweet and not so sweet reminders of the ranch house." Bellamy grinned and pulled the lid off a pot of something that looked suspiciously like her chicken and dumplings. Hallie clapped her hands and reached for a mug, not caring anymore if the women hadn't rung the dinner bell, so to say. Bellamy laughed. "You fit right in here, you know," she said, her eyes twinkling with delight. "Ever thought about staying?" Hallie moved over to fill a plate with fries. Her actions had made others in the room come over to start eating. "Yes," she admitted. "It's such a sweet little town." Bellamy nodded, moving along the other side of the table in tandem with Hallie and then meeting her on the end. "I'm overstepping here, but I'm kind of known for that." She gave a little shrug. "But I think this thing between you and Nash is definitely more than a fling." Hallie tilted her head. "Who said it was a fling?" she asked. Hallie hadn't talked about it a whole lot. She'd taken the teasing of her castmates and tried to push off Quinn's extra flirting to prove himself, but everyone she worked with understood wanting to keep things like relationships mostly to themselves. And Hallie hadn't had any time to get buddy-buddy with anyone from town either, anyone except Nash. Nash, but I think it's because he's just not quite sure what you're thinking, you know? Don't ever tell him I told you that." I'm already in a big enough hole with him for sharing private things. She grimaced. Hallie laughed. I promise. Personally, I hope we have a lot of time to explore this beyond the fling stage. She winked at Bellamy, who grinned back, and then noticed Nash coming in, so she waved and stepped away. Dumplings, Nash said when he greeted her with a kiss on the cheek. I see you're getting the A-list treatment from Belle. He took her plate from her and then grabbed her now free hand to lead her to one of the empty booths before it got commandeered by someone else. Addie brought over a burger and fries for Nash, with the flimsy excuse that she knew that Dr. Roberts probably didn't have a lot of time for lunch, before she hurried away with a knowing smile. See, told you she was sweet, Hallie said when she left. She just wanted an excuse to see if we were holding hands or something. Nash tapped a finger against his chin in mock contemplation. I didn't think she needed any more to gossip about after likely witnessing us making out here. You gonna hold my hand, or something? Hallie leaned closer to him and bit her bottom lip. How long do you have for lunch? Nash asked in a low voice before he dropped a light kiss on her lips. Hallie frowned. Like 20 minutes. Hurry and eat, and we'll go take a walk. There's a spot on the walking trail that's perfect for a few minutes alone. He wiggled his eyebrows as he said alone, making Hallie giggle. She dug into her food, now torn about how much chicken and dumplings she'd heaped into her oversized mug. Mind if I join you too? A voice asked. Hallie and Nash turned to see Quinn sliding into the booth across from them. Nash shared a look with her, the clench of his jaw saying he definitely minded. Neither of them said anything, but Quinn must have been ignoring the awkward silence. I've never had better food on set than now, right Hallie? Quinn said before taking a bite of a steak finger that Bellamy had made. Hallie tried not to grind her teeth at the tone. It was full of you're missing out and this is the Hallie and Quinn Club. Definitely not. She got busy eating her soup and patted Nash's knee underneath the table with her other hand. He started eating her fries. She'd make him come back and buy her some more later tonight, but for now she applauded his effort to get them out of the diner as soon as possible. Hallie is probably missing the Starbucks down the street from her house though. She can't go 2 days without a latte. Quinn laughed. Can't tell you how many times she sent someone out to find one in the middle of the night, you know, when we were shooting late, he added, though the smirk on his face implied far more. Actually, Addie makes really good coffee, Hallie jumped in. Much better than the Starbucks down the street from my house. She turned to Nash. What's it going to take for you to make a midnight run of her cinnamon dulce latte to me in California? She offered him an apologetic smile. Not much, he said tightly and took a deep breath. He grabbed the last of her fries, and she ignored the last few bites of soup. Should we go? She said, nudging against his side. He slid out so fast she was surprised he didn't fall out of the other side. We're going to get some fresh air, she excused. Yeah, he chuckled. We know all about fresh air. Hallie could have punched him for the insinuation in his tone. See you around, Nash said, taking Hallie's hand to lead her out of the diner. You know he's saying that stuff to get under your skin, Hallie said in a low voice once they'd left. There was still crew milling around outside. Yeah. He walked her around the back edge of the diner, through an alley until they reached the other end of the block. She stopped him, even though they hadn't reached the walking path she could see meandering into the nearby park. I had my chance to go there, and I didn't. There was a reason. He leaned over and kissed the top of her head. I know, Hal. It's fine. It's just. Knowing that I'm going back to California and possibly spending another season filming with him, and that he might take back the role just to needle you. Exactly that. Nash tugged on her hand again. How much time? Today? Until Wendy calls to tell me Jonah's irate that I'm not back on set yet. She leaned into his side. Nash made a show of looking around them. And if we're lucky, Quinn won't decide he also needs some fresh air. He used one hand to make an air quote. If he does, I'll use some Mallory moves on him. That's my girl.
Chapter 12. Nash took the next morning off to drive Hallie to the airport in Casper and threatened to take every exit off the freeway between Little River and there, turn around, and force her to stay. Hallie threatened to stuff him in her suitcase and make him come back to California. Should we talk about us actually having a long-distance relationship? He reached for her hand across the console, and she threaded her fingers through his. Nah. Let's call each other every night and see what happens. She leaned her head against his arm and watched the miles of open space go by. I'll have most of the summer off. And, maybe even more time after that. He squeezed her hand. Everything's going to be fine. You know it will be. You're right. It's a fabulous episode. Is Quinn going to stay? Nash even managed to sound like he thought that might be a good thing. Hallie pressed her lips together, the edges twitching. He hasn't said. I think he missed it. Nash snorted but didn't delve any more into discussing Quinn's behavior toward Nash and his flirting with Hallie. He and Hallie had talked about it enough. He didn't want to waste more time with her dwelling on the guy's behavior. He tried to believe that Quinn was actually jealous of Nash. For his relationship with Hallie, he could definitely believe that. But he couldn't quite banish the idea that it wouldn't be long once Quinn and Hallie were back in California, together. And could Nash handle another few seasons of Quinn and Hallie making out on screen? The logical move now for the show was for Declan and Mallory to make their relationship official and for the scriptwriters to explore the tension of spy life on a committed relationship. They had so many places to go with it, Nash knew, since he'd imagined quite a few scenarios he thought would play out well. He and Mr. Welling had even discussed some of them the night before when he'd had dinner with Hallie, Nash, and Bellamy at the ranch house. You can say that you hope the show goes under. I get it. Hallie couldn't even hide her smile anymore. He pulled her hand up to kiss her knuckles. I think you're an amazing actress with an amazing show and everything is going to work out. And if it doesn't, what should I do next? She asked. He spared a quick glance at her. Truthfully, he could probably drive most of this road with his eyes closed, it was so straight and empty. You mean, which of those scripts should you take? Hallie had discussed a few that had been sent to her. She didn't seem excited about any of them. No. Give me an idea. Jonah says if I don't want to do kick-butt detective shows, I need to come up with something different and go after it. But I'm not an ideas girl. You are. She shifted in her seat to turn and face him. An ideas girl? He smirked at her. Ha. You know, it took me a full 6 months to nail down the idea for my novel, he said. She stared at him and gave a skeptical shake of her head. You're putting me on the spot. I'll think about it. Promise. Remember that you're brilliant. She leaned over and kissed his cheek, and he wished they had more time. Why had he hidden behind the fake relationship for so long? Knowing that he would see her in only a few weeks when he made the visit they'd already planned didn't make it easier to say goodbye at the airport. Luckily, since it was tiny, their goodbye was semi-private, but Nash still walked away feeling like the whirlwind few days with her had been too short and not enough time to last until the next time he saw her. When he waved at her after she got through security, he almost had the urge to text Roxy and confess that she'd been right. There had been something missing for them. Nash had found it. He texted Bellamy instead and told her to pass the message along.
Chapter 13. Hallie woke up with a start 2 mornings later to someone yelling inside her condo. Hallie wasn't the partying type who let just anyone stay over, so the situation confused her even as the sleepiness drifted away. Hal! Something happened. Hal! Identifying Wendy's voice only made Hallie flop back against the pillows. She'd been up very late FaceTiming with Nash, and whatever urgent message Wendy had let herself into the condo to give could have waited beyond 7 a.m. Hallie grabbed her phone and ignored the texts Wendy had sent previous to arriving, finding a video message from Nash waiting for her from earlier that morning. Got called into the hospital way too early and thought I'd say good morning, gorgeous. I think I've graduated from liking you some to liking you a whole bunch. Talk to you later. Hallie murmured, playing the message again. Hallie, Wendy snapped, coming into the room and interrupting as Hallie started it a third time. Something has happened. They canceled the show? Hallie couldn't find herself caring as much as she had before Little River. She and Nash had talked about the kind of parts Hallie wouldn't mind looking for if Spies ended. Last night he'd thrown a few silly ideas at her, and despite him protesting that he wasn't being serious, Hallie had found more than one intriguing. What would Jonah think about a supernatural twist to the crime procedural? Hallie could totally dig solving murders in space. Those conversations had sparked an inkling of excitement for whatever came next. She could picture facing the unknown with Nash there to support her. And when she'd voiced that, he reminded her that Hallie Butler was a strong, independent woman who didn't need a man. But she did. Just one very specific man to say things like that to her and keep her smiling and happy and perfect. No, but that might be next. Wendy shoved her tablet in front of Hallie's face. A picture of Hallie and Nash kissing on set the night he brought her Bellamy's delicious zucchini fries topped the list of websites in a Google search Wendy had done. Hallie frowned at it, wondering who had snapped that shot, then let her gaze wander down the list of news links. Hallie Butler sets up fake relationship to save he spies, she spies. Was Hallie Butler's fake romance with hunky scriptwriter all to make Quinn Holloway jealous? He Spies, She Spies contest winner helped Hallie Butler lure Quinn Holloway back to save doomed show. And the list went on, every single headline berating Hallie for her deceit with Nash. What the? She scrolled down, cringing with every headline that came up and the thumbnails that popped up beside them, each another grainy snapshot of her kissing Nash somewhere in Little River. Where in the world had all of these pictures come from? Not that they'd been careful about where they'd kissed, but it wasn't like they'd made out in front of the entire town all the time. How did anyone even know about that? She whispered. Because to her knowledge, only one person knew. And he couldn't have. He couldn't have. Sure, Bellamy had told her that Nash had thought what he and Hallie had was a fling, but they'd graduated from that. They'd had tentative conversations about the future, made plans for lots of visits, discussed Hallie coming to Little River for a few weeks that summer. Someone who thought they were a fling didn't do that. They didn't gossip about how the relationship had started. It's true? Wendy cried. At first. Hallie threw the tablet on the bed. I didn't want Quinn pressuring me to be together like he was before. And then it really wasn't fake between me and Nash. And it was never to lure Quinn back at all. I went to ask Quinn to come back, like everyone wanted. I apologized and said that I was wrong. I only told him I was dating Nash so he wouldn't think that if he came back, I was going to start seeing him. She threw her legs off the bed. How did anyone even know? What do the publicists say? That you were the only thing keeping the show from going down the tank, and if the fans turn on you, there's no hope. Wendy cast her a sympathetic look. Who did you tell? No one. And it was Nash's idea at first. To help me. She shook her head as Wendy's eyebrows rose. To help me, she repeated. Nash did everything he could to stay out of the media. Why would he suddenly, willingly make sure his name was on every celebrity reporter's lips? She held out her hands. He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't. She didn't believe it, and she didn't want to let her insecurities push back her common sense. Call him. He needs to know about this. Allison wants a statement. What should we say? Hallie drew in a deep breath. She'd faced so many media blow-ups before this, and yet this one threatened to take away too many things she loved. She might love Nash Roberts even after so little time. But how else would anyone know? I don't know. She drew in a long breath. There's too much truth. It was fake for a few days. We did it to save Spies. But it's all twisted up, and I don't know. She pressed her fingers to her temples. I don't know. Call Nash. Wendy picked up her tablet and strode from the room. It didn't surprise Hallie that Nash didn't pick up when she called. Her video message from him earlier was recorded at just before 6 a.m., so he was probably knee-deep in the medical emergency he'd been called to the hospital for. She left a message. This is Hallie. I need you to call me as soon as you can. Wendy was gone when Hallie left her bedroom, so she jumped in the shower. If it was as bad as her assistant had insinuated by barging in at 7 a.m. with foreboding messages from the publicist, Hallie had better be prepared to face the day. She dialed Nash again when she got out of the shower but didn't get an answer. By the time she'd gotten dressed and pulled her hair into a bun, Wendy was back. She held out a caramel macchiato when Hallie came into the kitchen. Hallie chewed on her lip as she stared at the decadent drink. What's the bad news? The network execs are threatening to cancel the show. They're saying it was on the rocks anyway, and you losing fan support just makes things worse. Wendy grimaced. They're not even going to give this new episode a chance? What if Quinn decides to stay? Hallie put the coffee on the counter. I need to talk to someone about this. Quinn's saying he can't believe you did this, and there's no way he's coming back to be manipulated. Wendy held up her phone, showing a tweet from Quinn's account. Being part of the Spies world was a blast this last week. Disappointed that this is what the show did to get me there. Hallie grabbed her own phone from her pocket, sifting through the dozen or so messages on her phone that she'd missed that morning. None from Quinn. He didn't even try to talk to me or figure out what had happened before he posted that, she cried. She dialed his number, glad that at least he picked up. Seriously, Quinn? Next time tell me you don't feel the same, Hal. No need to make up a relationship to avoid it. Hallie's skin itched with how close to the truth that was, but she didn't deserve to have her name dragged through the mud over what turned out to be real anyway. And it had never been to manipulate Quinn into coming back. Quinn was the one who had left the show because he couldn't be a professional. He was the one who ignored all the entreaties the show's producers made to get him back. My relationship with Nash is not fake, and instead of clearing that up before you weighed in on this, you just made it worse. No need to make sure my career is ruined because you're mad about us, she retorted. I'm not coming back to the show, he snapped. Try being honest next time. He hung up before she could say anything else. She growled as she slammed the phone down. How did this happen? Wendy's phone rang before she could answer, and she slipped from the room, talking quickly to whoever was on the other end. Hallie grabbed the coffee her assistant had brought and gulped 3 swallows down before the burning caught up with her. She slammed the cup down, splashing coffee out of the small hole in the lid. When her phone rang, and a picture of her and Nash lit up the screen, she snatched it up. Is something wrong? He asked as soon as she said his name. I have 2 missed calls from you, a worrisome-sounding message, and about a dozen missed calls from Bellamy. I called you first, so I'm hoping she's not in danger or something. She probably called for the same reason I did, Hallie said. Already her stomach had started to unclench just hearing his voice. She prayed he could somehow make everything all better. Have you seen any entertainment news today? No. I've been at the hospital all morning. Is it bad? Concern filled his tone, and she suspected that Nash thought the show had been cancelled despite their best efforts. Someone told the press that we faked dated. At first, she hurried to add. There are terrible articles everywhere that I did it to manipulate Quinn to come back to the show. That's not what it was about at all, Nash said indignantly. I didn't tell anyone about this. Did you say something? Even in passing? Nash hesitated. Bellamy, but that's because she was getting her hopes up about us before it was not fake and was gossiping to Roxy. I was trying to control her expectations. Did she tell anyone else? Nash let out a long sigh. I can't imagine she would. Maybe Roxy. I'll call her. He paused, then asked, Is it bad? Yes. Hallie pinched the bridge of her nose. Execs are threatening to go ahead and cancel the show without even seeing what happens with next week's episode, and Quinn has made it clear he won't come back now. A lump formed in her throat. She thought she might be okay with moving on from the show, but having it stolen like this made her second guess. Spies was like her home. How could she give it up? She also knew how gossip like this worked. No matter what they said now, no matter what excuses they came up with, the story was out there. It would never go away. It wouldn't matter anyway. Quinn wasn't coming back, and Spies was circling the drain without him. I'm sorry. Nash paused again and then cleared his throat. Let me talk to Bellamy. I'll call you back soon. He hung up before she had a chance to say anything else. Hallie took a deep breath. He hadn't solved it. Her stomach had clenched right back up, and the weird tone to his voice added a few more knots to the mix. He hadn't even tried to reassure her, just got right into problem solving. Hallie didn't believe Bellamy would have intentionally spread it either, but if she'd told Roxy Dubois, Turner, Nash had said that Roxy's husband's real last name was Turner, and Roxy mentioned it to her husband, a famous country singer, in front of anyone? That would make a story go from some cute small-town gossip about the silly way Hallie and Nash had started dating to the derisive online articles filling the internet. Wendy came back into the kitchen, pocketing her phone. Nash? Hallie nodded and picked up her caramel macchiato again, taking a sip. What did he say? Wendy asked. He said something to Bellamy Hanson. Hallie stared down at the counter, listening to the way Wendy sucked in a breath. And you? Who was on the phone? We need a statement. Soon. We have to get your story out there. She dropped her head onto the counter. It's not going to matter. We both know that. We have to try. Hallie straightened, glaring at her phone. My relationship with Nash Roberts is not fake, and the pictures they're flooding the internet with prove it. Tell them if Quinn Holloway was so concerned with the future of Spies, he wouldn't have walked away because he couldn't get along with me. We'll see what the fans think of their golden boy when they get that covered-up tidbit. You want to get in a he said, she said with Quinn? Wendy arched an eyebrow. Hallie clenched her jaw. He started it.
Chapter 14. Bellamy pulled the phone away from her mouth and turned back to Nash. She says she didn't even tell Tag. He gets all squirmy when she talks about you. An almost smile quirked the corners of his lips. Tag Turner got squirmy of Nash. Did you tell Coy? Bellamy's cheeks pinked, and she gave a half shrug. Well, I tell Coy pretty much everything. She pulled the phone back to her lips. Gotta go, Rox. I have to call Coy. She pulled her phone away from her ear to tap at the screen. "I'm sorry, Nash. I didn't think it was a big deal." Nash shook his head and leaned over the plate of pie Bellamy had set in front of him as soon as he explained what happened. "I didn't either. Or I wouldn't have suggested we do it. I wanted to help her out with Quinn." He closed his eyes. She'd sounded so dejected over the phone. And short with him. Once he started looking at the headlines she was talking about, he understood. One stupid decision from him could blow up her career. He hadn't even thought about that. He hadn't thought about a lot of things, and it came to a relationship with Hallie Butler. It all felt so distracting, impulsive, amazing. All the things he figured Roxy had been talking about when she said something was missing for them. He didn't want to step aside once again when someone mattered to him, but maybe it would be better if he did. Tag was Roxy's soulmate, and if Nash had held on, or fought hard, he didn't know if Roxy would have realized it. He could have stolen that from her by not stepping aside, and that felt worse than letting her go without a fuss. Was the same thing true with Hallie? Was he stealing some kind of future he didn't even know about by hanging on? He tapped out a few more words on his phone while Bellamy talked to Coy. "Well, it had to come from someone. You're the only two I told," he heard her say with frustration. "Are you sure no one was in the room when we talked about it? One of your teammates or something?" A few moments later she ended the call and came to sit next to Nash at the dining room table. He said, and I quote, "Why would I talk about Nash Roberts' love life to anyone? I don't even hear half the stuff you tell me." "You didn't tell anyone else in town?" Nash ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Hallie had already said she didn't tell anyone. That meant the information had to come through him somehow. "Cross my heart." She frowned. "How did this happen then?" "I don't know. But I'm going to have to fix it. Can you do me a favor?" He tapped the post button on his phone, sending out his latest update to all his social media accounts. His followers had increased by the hundreds every day Spies was in town, and by a few thousand just since the news broke about him and Hallie's supposedly fake relationship. Bellamy's brows furrowed. What kind of favor? Nash handed her his phone, still up to the status he'd posted. "I need you to share this and tell people that I told you about it, that I told you it was my idea, and that I did it to get notice for my writing, not to manipulate Quinn Holloway." "But that's not true." Bellamy glared at the post. "This isn't true." "It's true enough." Nash took his phone back. "You have a gazillion fans after the whole catch thing, and since you know me, people will listen to you. Convince Coy to share it. And Tag and Roxy too. If we can make me the villain, maybe it will take some of the glare off Hallie and Spies will have a chance." Bellamy shook her head. "Nash. You can't do this." He stood up, his chair scraping across the floor and leaving his pie untouched. "You owe me." She scowled. "You said I didn't owe you anymore." "Please, Belle. I need to help her, and I need you to help me to do that. Thanks for the pie." Bellamy turned her scowl to the plate before huffing out a sigh. "Fine."
Chapter 15. Hallie hadn't engaged in a lot of social media the past couple years. She'd let Wendy handle most of her accounts. After the hate she'd gotten for Mallory Ryder betraying Declan on the show, it all became too draining. She came up with a few posts of her own, but Wendy mostly ran ideas past her, and Hallie approved them. But by the time she'd put her phone away that evening to spend some quality quiet time with her dinner, she'd spent the bulk of her day commenting on the debacle of her fake but not actually fake relationship. Quite a few celebrity bloggers had been happy to have her do live video interviews, and she'd divulged enough vague facts about how her and Quinn's friendship had dissolved the last season to satisfy a lot of people. At least they could say that most Spies fans were choosing sides and not just assuming Quinn was right on his take. Her phone dinged beside her at the table and she picked it up to turn off the social media notifications she'd turned on that day. Wendy could give her a report in the morning if anything had changed, and she could decide again then if she needed to get back into the fray. It was a message from Wendy with a link to a Twitter post. She almost ignored it until she finished eating but stopped when she saw Nash's account name. She clicked immediately to see what he'd written. No doubt something supporting the claims Hallie had made that day about them and about Quinn. She told him all about her fear with Quinn and how she could contrast that with the safety Nash made her feel. Of course he would come charging in to her rescue. She blinked in surprise at the words. I can't stand by today and watch Hallie Butler go down for my mistake. I used her to get my script in front of Jonah Welling and get noticed for my writing. She only told Quinn Holloway about our relationship so he wouldn't be surprised when he came to film his scenes. It's unfair of her to be blamed for my selfishness. She deserves the loyalty of she Spies fans. The post had been retweeted by Bellamy, Coy Jones, and Roxy and her husband, meaning that it had gained some serious traction in the last few hours. And the fans replying seemed to believe him. She forgot about her dinner and dialed Nash. It was another surprise that he answered. So often when she called, he was busy at the clinic or at the hospital. What did you do? She asked, the shock of reading his words still making her a bit breathless. It couldn't be true, she knew it wasn't. Jonah had seen his script long before Hallie met him. To her shame, a what-if still trickled into her consciousness in the moments it took Nash to answer. Maybe he didn't use her to get the script in front of Jonah, but he had suggested the fake relationship and that had gotten him far more face time with Jonah and the other writers than just being the contest winner, not to mention the legitimacy of Hallie backing him up. And when he talked about the relationship to his best friend, he'd called it a fling. Did that mean more than she thought it did? She dismissed it. He'd been so insistent about not being a part of it. An act? No. It couldn't have been. It was my fault. We haven't figured out yet how someone found out, but I'm the only one who said anything. Did it work? His voice held so much wariness. This was not the kind of thing Nash had to deal with, only since Hallie dropped into his life. Over the week she'd been in Little River, he'd waved away her references to his newfound social media fame. Bellamy was handling all of that. He didn't care. Today he'd had to care. It's not true. But her voice came up in a question, betraying some of the doubt that had attacked a moment before. Had it really been a fling and this was his out? If it worked, does it matter? She drew in a long breath. I don't know yet. The fans seem to believe you, but the next few days will tell if it's enough to change the execs' minds. I'm sorry, Hallie. His voice dropped to just above a whisper. I was careless, and that's not okay. Nash. She hated the guilt weighing down his words. She was the one who lived in the spotlight, her every move scrutinized and analyzed. Today had been a headache for her, and of course the worry about her show getting cancelled added to that. But this was all par for the course for her. These things happen. Show-ruining mistakes made by rookies? Not to you. You're careful, and I got you caught up in something without thinking through what the consequences would be. Maybe impulsive and passionate worked for Roxy and Tag. I don't know if it's the best idea for me. Hallie swallowed. What are you saying? He didn't answer for what felt like a long time. When we talked about if we could do long distance, I think we forgot to talk about something just as important. Long distance is cake, but the fact that we come from two very different lifestyles is not. Today proved that. He was breaking up with her. What you posted today. That's not true, right? She had to know now. She couldn't account for what he was doing without an explanation. Unless it was a fling, like Bellamy said. Unless he had used her. I didn't intentionally set out to use you, but I think that's what ended up happening. I'm sorry. He paused again, then added, I really am sorry. Let me know if you need me to post anything else or give an interview or Wendy can handle it. Hallie turned on her professional self, the one she should have used the first time Nash spoke to her. He was a fan. A big fan, one who wrote scripts based on her character. Good ones, yes, but still just a big fan. And instead of remembering that, she'd been charmed by him. She'd flirted and landed herself here, in a mess, and not even a sweet and kind man to stand by her through it. Nash might be wrong about how much fault he had in today's debacle, but maybe he wasn't wrong about walking away. He didn't want to handle it. She needed someone who was ready for it. I'm sorry, he repeated. It's life. I'll talk to you later. She swallowed after saying that. So many times that phrase had been more than an empty farewell. It felt so empty now. Later. He hung up. Hallie turned her phone off and went to her room. She stood by her bed, trying to shove away the sadness creeping up over her. It had been a fling. A whirlwind few days between two people from very different worlds. Real life wasn't like the movies, Hallie should know. So why did she feel so disappointed? It's this whole day, she said to herself. It wasn't just Nash breaking up with her, she insisted. It was all of it. She plopped on her bed, prepared to binge some Friends reruns, but only the good ones, when everyone got their happily ever afters. That's what Hollywood was good for.
Chapter 16. Bellamy scowled at Nash from their seats on the floor of the first finals game for the Denver Mountaineers. So you're never going to watch the last 3 episodes? Nash would mostly just like to bask in the fact that he had floor seats for a basketball championship game and not talk about Hallie and she spies. I doubt it. I know enough to know that Declan came back for the final episode, and I don't want to watch that. He grimaced. No doubt the writers gave the fans exactly what they wanted to send off Declan and Mallory into the sunset. And knowing that it was the end of the show only piled on the guilt. His post hadn't been enough to save the show. His only consolation was that it seemed to be enough that Hallie came out of the debacle looking better than Quinn Holloway, who fans had termed disloyal after the initial mess. Do you want to know what happened? Bellamy didn't seem to care that halftime was over and the Mountaineers were about to take the court again. Floor seats didn't mean much to her. Basketball was beyond her comprehension. Along with most sports. The fact that Coy Jones had several girls to choose from who were far more athletic and yet he ended up with Bellamy still made Nash laugh from time to time. The catch contestant who had run the girls' sports nonprofit probably would kill for these seats. If you tell me how it ended, are you going to promise not to bring up Hallie again? Nash leaned on his elbows to watch the start of the second half. On Bellamy's other side, Tag did the same. He smirked over at Nash. He supposed Bellamy's stream of questions was a small price to pay for floor seats to every home game of the Mountaineer Championship Series. And if he wanted to fly to LA, Bellamy would probably give him her seats for the away games. But LA would probably make it too tempting to go look up Hallie and forget about being responsible. That's a stupid promise to make. Maybe I'll tell you how it ended, because I doubt you're going to walk away from me now. She held her hand out toward the court. She also happened to catch the fact that Coy made a three-pointer and clapped excitedly for him. Fine. Tell me the end. Nash reached beneath his seat for his soda and sat up to take a long drink, never taking his eyes from the court, and Bellamy launched into her detailed explanation of the last 3 episodes, including the one Nash had written. Maybe he should have just sucked it up and watched them with her. So then they realize that Mallory isn't paralyzed after all, but she still decides to give up spy life and retire to a tropical island with Declan and all the cash he's stashed away over the years. I'll finally be able to sleep tonight knowing they ended up happily ever after. Nash couldn't keep the bitterness out of his voice. Quinn turning out to be a big jerk ruined the character of Declan for Nash. Mallory Ryder deserved someone better. Wonder how they got Quinn to come back. Rumor is a load of cash and threatening to sue him after he slandered everyone on the show. Plus, if he ever wanted another part at the network, I doubt he wanted Jonah Welling blacklisting him. Bellamy clapped again absent-mindedly along with Tag and Roxy. Some people are the worst. Roxy passed her phone along to Bellamy, who huffed and showed Nash a picture of them from the game the night before at a point in the game when Nash had leaned back and placed his arm along the back of Bellamy's chair. The celebrity blogger who'd posted it had added the caption, "Is Hallie Butler's former BF already out to use someone else? Coy Jones better watch his back." He shrugged it off. "We all know it's not true. Why does it matter? I brought my new rep on myself." He laughed. Turning himself into the bad guy hadn't bothered him at all. He didn't actually know any of the people bad-mouthing him, so it hardly mattered. If it helped Hallie, he didn't care what other people thought. The social media storm damage to himself had only lasted a few days, and then people moved on and found something else to care about. Maybe someday when he was ready to publish a book he might worry about his reputation, but then again, no publicity was bad publicity. People might look into his book out of curiosity and like it anyway. Oh, yeah. Makes sense. Bellamy passed the phone back to Roxy. "Is that why you ran off when things with Hallie got messy?" She arched an eyebrow. "Come on, Belle, take it easy on him," Tag said. "You know how difficult it can be watching someone you love get torn up by this business. It's not the same anyway." Nash shook his head at her. "Coy's not going to lose the championship because some doofus thinks we're more than friends. I did, 'cause some serious damage for Hallie. She deserves more than that. She deserves someone who's willing to weather this crap with her. Who will protect her when he can, or whose will take the beating when he can't." Bellamy flipped her phone at him, open to the post he'd written a month ago to take the heat off Hallie. "Kinda like this." Nash locked his jaw as he studied Bellamy, who only raised her eyebrows and put her phone away, turning back to the game in time to watch Coy dunk the ball. She stood up and whistled loudly, holding up the fingers on both of her hands in sign language for "I love you." "Hope someone snaps a picture of that," she muttered when she sat down. "Already done." Roxy grinned and began tapping away on her phone. Nash had to chuckle. He turned back to the game, Bellamy's words still rattling around in there. He'd take 1,000 more beatings like that for Hallie. The question was, did she want him to? Nash sat with Bellamy at the airport the next morning, waiting for their flights out of Denver. Bellamy was headed to LA to watch what she hoped would be the last game of the championships, with the Mountaineers walking away with a win and her boyfriend headed to Little River for a few weeks, at least, of the off-season. Nash was on his way to Casper and back to Little River. He was tapping away on his manuscript, pleased that he was over 3/4 of the way through the first draft. It helped that he didn't have any social life and that he'd spent most of his free moments the past month working on it. "I knew it." Bellamy cried triumphantly, making Nash jump. "Knew what?" Nash turned to her. Bellamy spun her laptop toward him, showing him the black and white pictures he recognized as being from the ranch house's security cameras. "This is the night you told me that you and Hallie's relationship was pretend. It was bugging me last night. We never figured out how it could have been leaked since none of us said anything, so I realized somebody must have overheard something. It could have been when you and Hallie were talking about it somewhere, but I wondered if it could have been at the ranch house. So I've been going through footage for that week. Nobody was around the night you and Hallie talked about it, but look at this. Someone was on the stairs, just around the corner around the same time you told me." Nash leaned over and studied the grainy picture. "I can't tell who that is. Based on the hair, I'm guessing Tolly Parker, Quinn's assistant." You know who would definitely not want he spies, she spies renewed. Someone who didn't want to come back to it but was getting pressure. And who'd been rejected by Hallie for you. Bellamy pressed a finger into Nash's chest. Someone like Quinn Holloway, and then he jumped right on her the same morning it broke. Like he already knew the truth and didn't have to ask anyone. She shut her laptop and stood up. Can you get some time off work? Because I think you need to come to LA with me. Belle. You didn't have anything to do with the show getting cancelled. Which means you doubly shouldn't have been moping around, blaming yourself. You had something with Hallie, right? He blew out a breath. He had. He missed it. He missed the way they analyzed their favorite Doug Robbins books, the way she thought he was a good writer now, the way she pushed him. The way she snuggled up against his chest and read scenes from his other scripts in ways that embarrassed him but also made him think how lucky he was to have Hallie Butler in his arms reading his stuff. Yes. Then come with me to LA. Okay. He stuffed his laptop in his bag and followed Bellamy to the ticket counter. Has anyone ever told you how bossy you are? Roxy. All the time. But you don't see her complaining, do you? Bellamy turned back and winked at him. Nash tilted his head. An idea had struck him. The idea. The one Hallie needed now that Spies was cancelled. His heart thumped hard. He couldn't wait to tell her.
Chapter 17. I know this is out of the blue, but can I have your address? Hallie blinked at the text from Nash. She hadn't heard from him since their last phone conversation, even though she missed him every day. It seemed crazy to think that a breathless romance that had lasted only a week could leave her so changed. But even when Jonah had told her they were canceling Spies, she'd been able to channel the optimism Nash had professed about her being able to get something good in a heartbeat. Maybe something even better than Spies. She believed Nash then, so she believed in herself. The cancellation hadn't come with the panic she'd been expecting in the weeks leading up to it. Instead, she felt peace. The next text came while she was still pondering why Nash might want her address. Also, can I come over? Her breath hitched. He wanted to see her? He'd run so fast when trouble had come before, and she could guarantee that trouble would come again if she intended to keep acting. Which she did. Could her heart take it if another media outburst around her sent him running again? You're in LA? She typed back. She wasn't avoiding giving him her address. She trusted him even despite the way they'd ended things and the claims he'd made online to save her reputation. But she was avoiding if she was ready. Yes. And I'd really like to see you. Please. Hallie's heart fluttered. She missed him so much, which confused her every day. While they'd spent every moment they could together in Little River, it hadn't been much. Maybe it was that all those little moments added up to something Hallie had never had before. Something that brightened her days and made her heart race. Someone she needed. She only waited a few more seconds before she typed out the address. Her doubts about Nash's feelings had been at their worst right after he broke up with her. With time she had seen how good the relationship had been. How good it could have been if Nash hadn't been so scared of it. Could she trust him to see it now? Thank you. On my way. Hallie's eyes widened as she jumped up and rushed from her living room. After the hectic schedule of filming, she'd taken the last few weeks very easy. Minimal showering, a lot of messy buns, wearing mostly leggings and oversized t-shirts. Where was Nash coming from? Did she have time to clean herself up and straighten her house? She knew the Denver Mountaineers were in town for the basketball championship, so had Nash come with Bellamy to watch? Were they at a hotel or coming in from LAX? Hallie rushed back to her bedroom. Cleaning herself up was first priority. By the time the doorbell rang 30 minutes later, she was in a pair of jeans and a more fitted t-shirt, curly hair around her shoulders, and all the takeout boxes on the coffee table and counter had been thrown in the garbage. "Hey," she said tentatively when she opened the door. I was dumb to freak out because of all that stuff. Nash didn't even step inside before the words burst out of him. I blamed myself and figured I'd ruined everything. "I'm sorry." He dropped his chin and his gaze while he took a deep breath, and shame emanated from his expression. She held open the door and reached up to take his arm and tug him inside. She'd had enough speculation about their relationship without having someone snap a picture of him on her porch. "Was it just a fling for you? Is that why you walked away so easily?" she asked, folding her arms and staring him down. "It wasn't easy at all, Hal. And it definitely wasn't a fling. From the beginning, all of it was so real for me." He held out his hands, pleading with her. She kept her expression stern, although his words melted her. She remembered him telling her how he was a terrible actor, and yet he'd kissed her all those times like a seasoned pro. It was all real. "I wish you would have asked me what I wanted instead of assuming." She kept her hands tightly against herself. She was already on the verge of forgiving him without a second thought. He stepped farther into the entryway and shoved his hands in his pockets. "I wish I would have too. I'm asking now if I'm too late to try and fix this." He pulled out his phone and tapped across it. "And if it helps, it wasn't actually my fault." He held up the phone to show her a grainy, black and white photo. "What's this?" "Tolly Parker. At the ranch house. Bellamy, and I think she might have overheard the night I told Belle that we were pretending. It's still kind of my fault, but much less than I thought." He pocketed the phone again. "I was never pretending. Not any of the times I kissed you, before and after the night at the diner. Before I asked you to fake a relationship with me. Probably even before I walked up to you on Main Street and found you reading my favorite book." With every sentence, he stepped closer and closer to Hallie, and she didn't back away from his advance. "Unless you got an advanced copy of your own, you still haven't read that book." Her lips had started to turn up at his declaration. "If you love it, so do I." He raised his eyebrows, his expression saying, "Please put me out of my misery. You said I could read it after you. Am I too late?" She tilted her head back to look up at him. "You have to be ready for messes and crazy to happen more. Those pictures they've been posting of you and Bellamy? It's amateur to what could come along. To what you might read about me. To what they're going to say about you." He gave a firm nod. "I'm ready. It doesn't matter as long as you always believe in me." She put her hands on his chest and leaned into him. "And as long as you believe in me." "I promise." Nash lowered his head to meet her lips, then wrapped his arms around her back, pulling her up to him and lifting her to her tiptoes. Every time Hallie had kissed Nash, it was like falling into the best romantic scenes, the times when things fit and the chemistry was there. When she didn't have to think, when she could just be. Those moments were so hard to come by in Hollywood, almost non-existent. But the way Nash held her made her believe in the magic the way an audience could when they didn't know everything that happened behind the scenes. Also, Nash whispered against her lips, "I have this idea. About a matchmaker who keeps getting mixed up in a local detective's cases." Hallie gasped and pressed away from him. "Freaking French fries, Nash. I'm so in. Let's call Jonah." He laughed at her food swearing, which she had found she preferred after picking it up from Bellamy. He threaded his fingers through Hallie's and leaned against the wall that blocked her door from her living room, pulling her with him. "Can we wait for a little bit? Maybe catch up first?" She arched an eyebrow at him. Promise me it's not because you're skittish about using me? He leaned over and kissed along her jawline, melting her back into him. Promise. He buried his face in her hair and took a deep breath. It's just that I'm so. He kissed the hollow of her throat, and Hallie's knees went limp. She clutched the front of his shirt. Distracted, Nash murmured. I can't think. He kissed her nose as he moved across to kiss the other side of her neck. Of anything else but you right now. Hallie wrapped her arms around his neck. Yeah. We can definitely call him later. Epilogue. Jonas stabbed several leaves of spinach with his fork and lifted it, waving it in Nash's direction. I love the notes, but are you really trying to convince me that we should go a whole season with nothing between Calliope and Mike? There's too much good stuff to their relationship without giving them some more tension. You shouldn't have cast Hallie. Nash gave an indifferent shrug, and Hallie shoved at his shoulder from where she sat next to him in the booth at Addie's diner. In the months after Nash had come to LA to apologize, Hallie had spent a lot of time in Little River, even booking a permanent room at the ranch house. And Jonah hadn't even complained too much about the weekends he'd spend in Wyoming while they developed the new show. Ha! Jonah took a bite of the salad and finished chewing before he went on. You basically wrote this part for her, so there was no other way to go. I had a lot of help from you, remember? Nash chuckled. You're probably right. You're actually always right when it comes to this. Just make sure I'm not on set. Should we have cast you as Mike instead? Hallie asked, grinning up at him. Nash snorted with laughter and shook his head. The screenwriting thing did turn out okay, but I can promise that me acting would not. He set down his hamburger and leaned over the table, glancing at Hallie before he went on. How's it going convincing the execs to film out here? I think I've got them on board. Hallie should start house hunting. Jonah winked at the couple. Perfect. Nash turned to Hallie and scooped an arm around her waist. What do you think about that? Who do you think sacrificed a chunk of her salary to make it happen? She took his cheeks in her hands and pulled him toward her for a kiss. She hoped the show took off, that it had as many good seasons as Spies had and more, so she could enjoy the somewhat quiet life in this town with Nash. Well, I'll leave you two to celebrate. I've got a flight to catch tonight. Jonah pulled out his wallet to leave some cash. You coming back to LA with Hallie to finish casting? He asked as he scooted out of the booth. I'm sure she'll convince me. Now that we finally have another doctor in town, I can swing a few more days off. He reached up to shake Jonah's hand. See you in a couple weeks. Jonah waved as he exited the diner. Nash turned back to Hallie. About the house thing, I was wondering what you thought of mine. Oh. She leaned in closer. Also, what you thought about my last name. Specifically my last name being your last name. She straightened, her stomach taking flight with dozens of butterflies, like the final few seconds before she filmed an emotional scene. Nash. We've only known each other 6 months. He slid his fingers around the back of her neck, relaxing her toward him and bringing his lips within inches of hers. It was hard to think with Nash that close to her. Hard to remember why 6 months was so short. She felt like she'd known him so long. I fell in love with you after only a week, he said softly. He put his other arm around her back and held her close, kissing her for a long time. You need a house. I'm being practical. She giggled. Oh, is that all? If you guys keep this up, I'm going to have to cordon this booth off with curtains out of respect for the other patrons, Addie said dryly from the end of the table. Nash turned to look at her over his shoulder. Addie was smirking at them both and didn't look upset at all. If Hallie says yes that she will marry me, will you give us a pass this one time? Addie's eyes brightened. Obviously. Say yes, say yes, say yes, Nash whispered in Hallie's ear. She laughed again. Fine, she said in mock reluctance. It's really only logical. Addie gave a whoop. Nash Roberts is officially off the market, folks. The dozen or so others in the restaurant gave a cheer as well, and Nash laughed as he kissed Hallie once more. Nothing about this is logical, Hal, he said when he pulled away for a moment. And that's exactly how it should be. Thank you for listening to this audio presentation of Hallie's Hero, Love in Little River Book 4, by Renee S. Clark. If you enjoyed this book, consider leaving a comment below or a review on Amazon. Check out other Love in Little River books available on audio. Roxy's Song, read by the author. Dating Drew, Catching Coy, and the professional audio narration of Battling Ben. All the Love in Little River books are available in Kindle Unlimited in Amazon. Get a free Love in Little River prequel novella by signing up for Renee S. Clark News. Details are in the description below.